another arms race, be it conventional or non-traditional arms, such as biological or even cyber. Some major powers gradually reposition the main threat perception back to state sovereignty, instead of shared issues like climate change. Obviously, some question emerge then. What is our best strategy to deal with this new normal of geopolitical volatility? To what extent that we can keep our faith to the multilateral diplomatic channel? In the middle of these various challenges to the international political structure, increasingly challenged by a constantly changing world, Indonesia and Germany are, fortunately or unfortunately, provided the opportunity to work together as non-permanent members of the Security Council for these 2 years before handing over the baton. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a full day of fruitful discussion on the topics that are contained in the program, on the enhancing women's role in peace and security, mainstreaming awareness on the climate change conflict nexus, working together in countering international terrorism, and reforming the UN Security Council. Last year, I said we had 1 day to solve this international problem. Apparently, we did not succeed. So hopefully, at least for this event today, we can build dialogue to seize the opportunity for the promotion of common interests between Jakarta and Berlin, as we have the potential for furthering the preservation of peace and security and navigating the global dynamic shift. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your warm welcome, Dr. Vermonte. And now I would like to invite Mr. Jan Zenkia to give his welcoming remarks. To Mr. Jan Zenkia, you may have the floor.
Thank you. Dr. Philips Vermonte, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure and honor for me to welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to the opening session of the third Germany-Indonesia Strategic Dialogue, which will take place today here in the premises of CSIS and tomorrow in the Indonesian National Security Council, Lemhanas. This is, as Dr. Vermonte has already mentioned, the third meeting of the Germany-Indonesia Strategic Dialogue, and the purpose is to bring together experts and stakeholders from both countries in order to discuss and analyze issues of common interest and of strategic importance for both countries. We would like to encourage the exchange of ideas and information, and perhaps also to provide concepts and analysis for solutions and inputs for decision makers in both countries. And moreover, we want to contribute to the establishment of a bilateral and international network as part of the Track 2 dialogue. That means non-governmental and informal contacts and activities. For our Indonesian friends, I would like to explain the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is a German political foundation with a long-standing commitment to public education and development cooperation in Germany and worldwide. In Indonesia, we have been active already since 50 years, and we organize a variety of programs and projects in order to promote peace, democracy, and development. So all these goals cannot be reached without stability and security, and that's why the strategic dialogue we would like, with the strategic dialogue, to provide a platform to address current challenges and issues of common interest. Ladies and gentlemen, as Dr. Felix Vermonte has already mentioned, this year both countries, Germany and Indonesia, have been elected as non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, UNSC. So together with the 5 permanent and the other 8 non-permanent members, they will be responsible for the next 2 years for maintaining peace and security in the world. That is the mission of the UNSC. So this provides the opportunity to work together on issues of common interest and to coordinate initiatives in this prime security institution of the international community. Of course, Germany and Indonesia are countries with a different background, different location. Germany representing Europe, Western Europe, Indonesia representing Asia, Southeast Asia. We have different history, different religion and culture. But both countries are large democracies with strategic importance within their respective regions. Both countries are committed to a rule-based international order and to the principles of multilateralism. And they both are engaged in peace diplomacy, acting as peace mediators or facilitating dialogues between disputing countries and disputing parties in various countries and regions abroad. So the topics which will be discussed during the strategic dialogue today and tomorrow are reflecting upon some areas of common interest or concern for Indonesia and Germany, and could be coordinated and brought up in joint initiatives or as proposals in the UNSC. So I'm very happy that we succeeded again to bring together a number of high-ranking and high-qualified experts from both countries to this dialogue. And I would like to thank on this occasion the Center for Strategic and International Studies, its director, Dr. Felix Vermonte, and his team for the excellent cooperation and preparation of this event. And I wish all the participants an interesting and fruitful discussion and dialogue the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen Kiev, for the excellent remarks. May it serve well for our knowledge for the upcoming session. And now I would like to invite Ms. Grata Endah Werdaning Tias to come up to the stage to give a keynote speech for our discussions today. To Ms. Werdaning Tias, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, Bapak Philip Vermonte, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I would like to convey the regret and well wishes from our Directorate General for Multilateral Affairs, Bapak Fabian Rudyard. He is unable to attend this dialogue and has asked me to read out this statement on his behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, the world today is at a critical juncture. The global balance of power is shifting, and the post-World War II security architecture is challenged. We are witnessing, among others, the rising of China in India, the growing influence of some of emerging countries, including Indonesia. At the same time, we are seeing the increasing challenge to multilateralism, such as the rise of non-state actors and the retreat to unilateral acts by some of the great power who are actually the champion of multilateralism at the beginning. Non-traditional and asymmetric security threats have become even more pressing than ever. and transnational organized crime are becoming more complex and multidimensional in nature. The growing nexus between security and non-security issues such as security impact of the climate change or terrorist financing have obtained more recognition. In the face of such formidable challenge, the efficacy and effectiveness of the UN Security Council as the premier body responsible for the maintenance of world peace and security has acquired even more critical importance. However, there are always however at the end of each statement. These challenges have often created disunity in the Council, and at the same time, at the time when unity and coherence among UN Security Council members is very much needed. Within this context, the role of elected members of the UN Security Council have become more important than ever. Now, let me take this opportunity to encourage everyone to stop using the word non-permanent member and start using the word elected 10. Let's use the term elected 10 from now on, or in short, E10. Why? The word elected of the E10 represent the democratic side of the UN Security Council. These 10 countries represent the wider membership of the UN Security Council through direct vote. This is also Indonesia experience when we were campaigning to get elected for the UN Security Council membership. It was not easy to obtain the vote of confidence of the other UN member. You need to have track record and vision. You need to gain trust. It is not something that Indonesia take for granted. Having what I call the democratic credential, the role of E10 countries is thus paramount to the credibility and legitimacy of the Council itself. Nevertheless, their ability to perform in the Council are often severely and structurally limited. In many cases, this is due to the working method of the UN Security Council that give precedence and extraordinary power to the permanent members. However, this is also due to some other factors such as national interests and regional affiliation. Indeed, the challenge for us, the elected 10, are systematic and multifaceted. In this regard, I would like to highlight two pertinent points to guide our further discussion regarding how to enhance the role of elected 10 countries. First, while the elected 10 is not a monolithic group, it is still possible to build a shared vision. Now, the reality is, individually, each of the elected 10 has their own national interests and respective agenda. National interests naturally take precedence and remain our #1 priority while we are sitting at the Council. Furthermore, each of us also represent regional grouping and other constituents of state that have entrusted us with their vote and expect us to vote their collective concern and interests. Indonesia's position as a member of ASEAN, for example, non-aligned movement, and also as OIC, or Germany's position in the European Union. These overlapping interests, agenda, and goals are difficult to reconcile by each of us, let alone when we're trying to come up with collective shared interests. But my message today, still, this is not impossible. I wish to cite an example to illustrate how this is possible. Now, I hope all of you have seen the movie Pacific Rim. I like the first one, by the way. The main protagonist of the movie is a bunch of robots called Jaegers. Now, Jaegers is a huge robot, and it is such a powerful machine, and therefore each of them need to be piloted by two different individuals. Now, each pilot have a different person and have their own thinking. but they must make sure that their perspectives are connected and share the same vision in order to make the robots work. In fact, that is the case on how we make the UN Security Council work as a whole, that each member, while pursuing their own national interests and agenda, must align their perspective and have a shared vision. I believe for the elected 10, there are some common necessity that can serve as their collective vision. For example, the responsibility to ensure good quality outcome and decision of the Council, the need to continuously working together to democratize the Council, especially its working method and decision-making process, and to some certain extent, the responsibility to bridge the differences and the disunity among the permanent 5. Greater collaboration, coordination, and consultation among the elected 10 is therefore a key to attain this goal. Based on this recognition, starting from last year, as soon as Indonesia was elected in June, Pak Febri and I started a consultative process with all members of the Council, both permanent and elected members. Indeed, close consultation at the New York level is important, but close consultation at the capital level, it's no less important because the high-level decision makers are based in the capital. Now with this, I would also like to inform that on the 5th of July, we'll have another visit to Berlin, thanks to the invitation of the government of Germany to have a round of bilateral consultation and a focus group discussion on issue of common interest. Now through these consultation processes, Indonesia is able to build a better and mutual understanding of each other's perspective, so that together we can better navigate UN Security Council like the Jaeger robots. Now second, we need to address the systematic and structural challenge faced by the elected 10. As the permanent 5 countries have perpetual presence at the Council, they have accumulated the depth of knowledge and experience in the Council working methods. On the part of the elected 10, the rapid turns of membership and relatively short tenure of the Council, only 2 years, result in limited institutional memories within each of the elected 10. These include both diplomatic and procedural processes, as well as on substantive subject matter issue under the discussion of the UN Security Council. Another pressing issue is the fact that many elected 10 countries may face resources constraints that hinder them from effectively and substantively participate in numerous council deliberation and meetings. We have seen a lot of improvement in the last several years to address this issue. For instance, the election of incoming elected 5 is now conducted in June, is already conducted in June, rather than in October, which was the practice several years ago. Now the incoming 5, as they've been elected in June, now have been provided with more opportunity to observe the council work 3 months prior to the start of their membership. It started in October to December. All this give elected 10, incoming 10 countries more time to prepare for their membership. The publication of Note 507, document that compile UN Security Council working method and practices, has also been very useful. Several elected countries has actually becoming champion on publishing the Note 507. Such initiative aim at supporting the incoming 5 preparation and enhancing their capacity and readiness to discharge their mandate should continue be promoted. And I encourage all of you to make the most of this forum to discuss what kind of initiative that we can do to promote and to address this structural challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, for every challenge there is an opportunity. In this regard, and as I mentioned before, the key to creating opportunities is by pursuing greater collaboration, coordination, and consultation among the elected 10. I have provided some illustration before. Now allow me to add some more example that can become further fruit for thought of this forum. In early April, Germany, France, a combination of P5, permanent 5, and elected 10 members have launched the Alliance for Multilateralism to counter the increasing tendency of unilateral acts by some of the great powers. Indonesia has been happy to join this initiative as one of the founding fathers. South Africa has also launched a series of meetings among elected 10 countries in Pretoria to address issues of common concern and discuss possible areas of collaboration among elected 10. On our part, Indonesia intends to host similar coordination meeting among elected 10 towards the end of the year. During Indonesia presidency last May, we has also introduced a new working format to the Council called the Regional Wrap-Up Session. Now, unlike the previous wrap-up session that entirely presented by the President of the Council, Indonesia took the initiative to invite fellow elected members of the Council to represent their respective region and provide assessment of the various meetings held under our presidency. Thus, Kuwait delivered its assessment on the development in the Middle East. Poland provide an overview in the conflict in Europe and the issue of protection of civilians. Peru addressed the issue of counterterrorism, and Equatorial Guinea provide an assessment on African issues. This format was well received by many parties as it provides a platform for regional representatives to voice their view and reflected unity among the elected 10. Another notable achievement of the elected 10 collaboration is the joint submission of a letter from current and incoming non-members late last year. The letter was sent as a sign of protest to the permanent members for their inability to come up with an agreement on the division of work and pen holdership among the elected 10, which sadly, we still requires the permanent 5 approval. But we sort of like receive a crumble of cake from the permanent of 5. As incoming member, Indonesia associated itself with the letter to ensure a more participatory and democratic Security Council. Bearing this initiative in mind, it is therefore in our interest to develop and support initiatives that serve as a platform for cooperation and promotion of common interests among the elected 10, including our meeting today, especially as this strategic dialogue involves the best and the brightest mind from Indonesia and Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, while it is true that permanent members have larger advantages than the elected 10 of the Council, each one of us sought a seat at the high table to exert influence and make a difference. This is not impossible. However, it will require political willingness, a joint effort, and intellectual leadership. It is not something that we can take for granted. We must therefore move beyond business as usual. In this regard, I have every confidence that this strategic dialogue could identify a number of fresh ideas on this, and I do hope that guiding decision that I have presented will be relevant for all of you as you deliberate the issue in the next 2 days. After all, it is our collective interest to ensure UN Security Council could effectively maintain international peace and security. Before closing, let me just add one more point. I anticipate that during the discussion there will be question and doubt raised by any one of you about the benefit of having the UN. We are focusing so much on the inability of UN Security Council, for example, to resolve many of new and long-standing conflicts globally. No, this is why I raised this issue, because this is the question that I always receive from the audience since last year when we are preparing and have many discussion with our stakeholder at the nation, at the global level on how we are going to promote our membership. Now, my answer is always simple. I always ask the audience, instead of asking this question, let us ask ourselves, what will the world do without the UN in the last 60 years? So this is the question, instead of asking whether the UN works, but focusing if there is, can you imagine the world without the United Nations? Now, thank you very much. I wish a fruitful and constructive conversation in the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful speech, Ms. Verdaning Tias. Distinguished guests, as a part of our customs, now we will have a group photo session for role players. So to all role players and speakers who are present in this room, I invite you to come in front of the stage. And I would like to notify to all the honorable guests that we will not have any coffee break between sessions, but we provide refreshment outside the auditorium, so if you want to, feel free to take it. Thank you for all the role players who have participated. You may now return to your seats. We have now come to the beginning of today's session, filled with fantastic set of speakers and moderators. As our agenda goes, our first panel for the day immediately touches on a very important issue that has gained more and more attention today. We will have our first panel on enhancing women's role in peace and security. This will be moderated by Mr. Gilang Kembara, researcher at Department of International Relations at CSIS. To Mr. Kembara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, MC. Could I extend a warm welcome and invitation to all the panelists that will be joining me on session 1, Bapak Hari Prabowo, Dr. Gudrun Wake, and Ibu Fitriani, to please join me up on the stage, please. Thank you very much. in late 2016, the United Nations, I strictly remembered, appointed Wonder Woman as the UN honorary ambassador for female empowerment. Now, the move, which somewhat coincided with Wonder Woman's 75th birthday, drew immense backlash, both internally and also from the wider external community. Now, Wonder Woman's stint as an ambassador briefly ended after just 2 months, although it was considered to be the longest for a fictional character to hold that position. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang di KAS-CSIS. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Gilang Kembara. I am a researcher here at the Department of International Relations, and it is my job this morning to safely moderate the first session of the day. Safely because for me, I hope I don't make a lot of silly mistakes within this session. Earlier, I took the liberty to use the case of Wonder Woman as a UN honorary ambassador to highlight the level of insensitivity that people, or perhaps the male-dominated hierarchy, still have when they attempt to comprehend the subject of female empowerment, or perhaps in this case where we're having this session, women's roles in peace and security. With me this fine morning are 3 experts on foreign policy and international security who will shortly present their critical insights on this matter. I shall briefly introduce all 3 speakers before I pass the floor to them. The first speaker I have on my list is Bapak Hari Prabowo. Selamat pagi, Pak Hari. Bapak Hari is a longtime diplomat, having worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for almost 20 years. Am I correct, Pak? His current position at the ministry is as a coordinator for the Indonesian UNSC task force under the Directorate General of Multilateral Cooperation. Our second speaker is Dr. Gudrun Wacker from Germany. Herzlich willkommen, Doctor. Dr. Wacker is a senior fellow in the Asia Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP. Her primary research hovers around Chinese foreign and security policy and security cooperation in Asia Pacific. Dr. Wacker also holds the position of the EU representative at the ASEAN Regional Forum Expert and Eminent Persons. Last but not least, our third speaker is an esteemed colleague of mine, Dr. Fitriani. Pagi, Mbak. Dr. Fitriani is a researcher here at CSIS, where she focuses on strategic and security issues, women in peace and security, and Indonesian foreign policy, of course. She has held various research prior to joining CSIS across the world, including, I believe so, in Technical University of Dortmund in Germany, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, and the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. So before we begin today's session, could I just kindly remind everyone to switch their mobile to vibrate mode? And I also like to kindly ask everyone to refrain from answering any calls within the premises as long as the session is still going on. So ladies and gentlemen, without me taking much more time than I've already done, I would now like to respectfully offer the floor to our first speaker, Bapak Hari, and each speaker is allocated 15 to 20 minutes of time. And please welcome Pak Hari Prabowo. The floor is yours.
Uh, Good morning, selamat pagi Pak Dubes, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. It's truly an honor for me to be here. The speaker was supposed to be Ibu Grata, who delivered the keynote presentation on behalf of Pak Dirjen earlier. But due to another pressing engagement, she asked me to deliver this presentation. Perhaps I can start by sharing that when I started to work at the Foreign Service, that's almost 20 years ago, at that time the term we used was women empowerment. Now the term that we use is gender empowerment. One of the reasons is because women's role in foreign ministry, in the Indonesian foreign ministry, has been very strongly mainstream. And not only mainstream, it has become part of daily life. It's strongly rooted into the machinery of the Indonesian foreign policy. So now, women empowerment is no longer the question. The question now for us is gender empowerment. Because even it's no longer how to ensure that women play the same role, but also on how male diplomats, as we often joke among us, find relevance in today's changing world. Having said that, the main spirit for us in undertaking our job at the foreign ministry is diplomacy for the people, or what Pak Jokowi often mentions, diplomasi yang membumi. And our foreign minister also often reminded us, diplomasi yang membumi, or diplomacy for the people. So at the foreign ministry, we have to make sure that our foreign policy is in line with national development priorities, particularly to help realize social justice and welfare for all the people. And when we talk about gender issue in foreign policy, there are several guiding documents. The first one is, of course, the 1945 Constitution. Second is CEDAW, the convention. And then the third one is Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Number 4 is presidential instruction on gender mainstreaming in national development. And number 5, and which is very relevant in the current context of current administration, is the second and the fourth Nawacita. Now, in applying gender issue in foreign policy, we have external context and internal context. The external context is, of course, how to apply and project gender issue in our foreign policy in the bilateral, regional, and multilateral context, while the internal aspect is about national policies and management, how to engage with domestic stakeholders, but not less importantly, how to inject the issue of gender issue in MOFA itself. Now in my presentation on women's role in peace and security agenda, I will basically divide into 5 subtopics. The first one is regarding peacekeeping operations and sustaining peace. Second one on disarmament. Third one on transnational organized crime. Fourth one on countering terrorism. And finally, women's participation at Kemlu itself, at the foreign ministry. Women's role in peacekeeping operation. This is an issue that we as Indonesia, we as Indonesian foreign ministry are very much passionate about. Indonesia is currently one of the biggest troops and police contributing countries for UNPKO. At the moment, we deploy 2,816 peacekeepers. Only 105 of them are women. But this 105 is actually quite an achievement already compared to the number that we managed to achieve last year. So it's a continuous improvement, but we want to achieve more. And why do we see the need to enhance the role of our peacekeeper, female peacekeeper? One is because based on experience on the field, female peacekeepers are better capable of situational awareness for safety and security. They are better positioned in liaising with the community, in gaining their trust. And therefore, they are also better positioned to provide comfortable protection, comfortable assurance against such issues as sexual violence. And they also help to increase local acceptance of the communities towards UNPKO. Now, beyond peacekeeping, we also have to see the need to sustain peace. And this is also where women play a very important role. They can take up the role as early peace builders. Indonesian PKOs, they are actively go to the community, engage with the community. They play the role as teachers, for instance, as doctors. And in many ways, female peacekeepers, the acceptance from the local communities when they are playing this community engagement role is more effective. And they become a role model for inspiring and encouraging local women, those who are still traumatized by conflict, by interacting directly with the female peacekeepers. They really provide an incentive. Well, they really provide encouragement for these local women to emerge from the conflict. So that is why it provides a solid foundation for to have greater chance for successful peace building, and also in fostering reconciliation in the communities. There are beyond peacekeeping, and we are talking about sustaining peace and different stages of peace processes. There are several means for us to work for an inclusive participation of women in peace. One is, of course, direct participation in negotiation table. And there was a research by UN Women that women's direct involvement in peace process actually enhance the possibility of a longer lasting peace process by 20%. And of course, another part is they have to be consulted, especially on issues of direct relevance to them. And they have to be involved in public decision making, problem solving, and other means to enhance their involvement. Now, moving to the next subtopic, which is disarmament, these are several instruments on disarmaments related to women's role that we have, starting from the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, all the way until UNSC disarmament agenda. But this is, I want to elaborate more on the next slide, which is why women's role in disarmament is important. First, because disarmament needs to be viewed from multiple angles. To be effective, disarmament needs to be viewed from multiple angles because this is a multi-dimensional issue. And because it affects communities as a whole, and it affects women and men, but in affecting their communities, the impacts to women and the impacts to men are rather different. The impacts on women also correlate to the impacts to children, for instance. And this is important to advocate women's inclusion in peace and reconstruction process, as we discussed in earlier slide. Another subtopic is on women's role in transnational organized crime. And especially, one of the main concerns here is various organized criminal activities that involve sexual violence and exploitation. And women and children are particularly vulnerable to these types of transnational organized crime. And at the multilateral level, UNTOC is the main forum to address this issue. These are again some of the international instruments dealing with the issue of women and TOC. And the next subtopic is on countering terrorism and de-radicalization. Also another issue of very utmost importance for Indonesia, having been a victim to terrorism several times. And at the multilateral level, we serve as co-chair of Global Counterterrorism Forum, GCTF, especially the working group on countering violent extremism. And therefore, Indonesia has a direct role in managing this issue at the global level and in connecting the discussion at the global level with initiatives at the national level. At the national level, we have many important initiatives, training programs, workshops to train women to be agents of peace in countering radicalism and terrorism. And when we develop policies and programs to prevent and counter terrorism, the government is actively pursue an inclusive approach by engaging women and women's civil society organizations in the process. One NGO of particular importance here is religious-based CSO, whose values, whose thoughts are very much relevant in terms of developing de-radicalization programs. Finally, the final subtopic is about women's representation in MOFA. And we can see that over time, the number has been increasing. So now the diplomatic foreign service officer, let us see perhaps the most MOFA recruitment trend in 6 years. So in 2013, we recruited 70 new diplomats, 51% female diplomats, and then 49% male. So in the last 2018, 2017, the composition of women new recruits have exceeded the number of male recruits. And along these initiatives, we are also trying to make the foreign ministry a more hospitable place for women diplomats. The provision of childcare and other facilities that hopefully can help our female colleagues to optimize their role. And so while at the moment, diplomatic foreign service officer is still 63% men and 37% women, but we are, because of in the last several years, the number of new recruits have bigger proportion of women, then we project this proportion to be balanced in the several years to come. So that concludes my presentation. I'm sorry if I exceeded the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bahari. Actually, you're well within the time given. Thank you very much. Thank you for providing us with the policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it comes with women within the ministry, and also how you handle it externally outside. I do have something that I have in mind. Maybe I can ask you later. But without taking much of the time, I want to go on straight to our second speaker. And I do have in my list is Dr. Gudrun Wake. And I believe now the time is yours. Please.
Thank you very much, and I start by thanking the organizers and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to give me a chance to speak here. This is my second time in Jakarta only, so I'm very happy to come back. Actually, what I'm going to say fits very well in what we heard already. You covered sort of the basics why it is important to include women at all stages of conflict. And I will talk a little bit about Germany, but also at the UN Security Council. I think the major step has already been done during this period. So the question is more what we can do in the next 2 years. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of the first Security Council resolution that dealt with this issue of women, peace and security. And so the German application for becoming an elected a non-permanent member in this period from the beginning had this as one issue on the agenda, women, peace and security. And there was a plan to introduce a new resolution that would close the gaps before, in the resolutions before. One idea was to have a more survival-centered approach, which means one very fundamental issue was not how to increase the number of women involved in conflict resolution, but how to deal with the victims of sexual violence, the children born out of this or not born, and also to establish a new working group at the UN level to deal with this specific issue. So in April this year there was an open session, and the surprising development was, and it fits in what in the keynote we heard in the beginning, it was the resistance was not mainly coming from Russia and China, but it came from the US. So US threatened to veto the text of the resolution, or the resolution as such, and there were two main reasons for that. One was the role of the International Criminal Court that was described in this resolution text, because so far not a lot of perpetrators of sexual violence have been brought to justice, neither at the national level or any ad hoc sort of courts or the International Criminal Court. So this resolution tried to describe and define the role of the International Criminal Court. Now we all know that the US is not a member of the International Criminal Court and did not support it from the beginning. But the real issue was reproductive health. So it was the trend in the United States to roll back on abortion rights for women. The global Gag Rule is reinforced, so countries who have the right to abortion do not get developmental aid. And so this was the passage where the US had the biggest protest against. And even when Germany offered to compromise and just refer to a previous resolution of the UN Security Council with language that had been agreed by everybody, the US still threatened to veto. So in the final outcome, the resolution was adopted with a very much watered down text, you could say. And for the first time also, Russia and China abstained. They didn't support the resolution, but they abstained. There were actually some women's NGOs in Germany who from the beginning had concerns about the text of this resolution and whether this is the right time to table it. But I think if we wait until the international environment becomes better again, probably we will never get another resolution. So I still think it's better to move forward, even if it's only by inches on the issue, than doing nothing at all. I will talk a little bit about what Germany has been doing. So we have two national action plans. One was covering the years 2013 to 16, and one 2017 to 20. There is also sort of an assessment of the first period in the second action plan. And it's considered a very important cross-cutting issue in foreign policy, security policy, and development policy for German policy. But we don't have an implementation strategy in place. And I think this is a more general problem that we see all over the world that at the level of rhetorics, there is a lot going on, but in terms of implementation, the progress has been very, very slow. Even on raising the share of women, you know, women's peacekeepers, etc., it has improved, but not dramatically, I would say. So this is one major dimension that is lacking, that there is not really a plan how to implement all of that. For the German government, I think the primary objectives are to sort of support that this is mainstreamed in the EU agenda, which has been happening over time, and in the other international organizations or regional organizations where Germany is a member. That means NATO and the OSCE. And again, there has been progress in terms of statements, but the issue is pretty much mainstreamed, but what has been happening on the ground is probably a little more disappointing. Then at the UN level, we also support certain other agencies outside the UN Security Council, like the Focal Point Network, and there is a focus on the African Women Leaders Network that was founded in 2017, so this is supported. If you ask for role models, I think German texts usually raise Sweden and the UK, who have been much more proactive in actually improving the role of women. If I understand correctly, Indonesia also has an action plan, a national action plan, on improving the women, peace and security agenda, but the main level is ASEAN, and there is a plan that the ASEAN Regional Forum will take up this topic as well. I read that there is a ASEAN-Australia dialogue on women, peace and security. So I looked a little bit into that to figure out whether there is, you know, what platforms we could use besides a bilateral dialogue. And I think because Germany has a very strong commitment to the EU and Indonesia has a very strong commitment to ASEAN, actually this is one venue, and I already come to the conclusions. My first conclusion is to underline what I said earlier. Our problem is not the rhetorical level and public statements. It's really how to move forward in practical terms. If you look at the last 19 years, I think the figures are now at the UN peacekeeping operations, 30% of the civil personnel are women, but only 9% of the police forces and 2% of the military service. And of course that has to do with the fact that in a lot of countries that provide a lot of troops to PKOs, women don't play a big role in the military in the first place, right? So the progress has been, let's put it, glacial. And I think it's better in terms, even that is a better performance to improve the share of women in the diverse stages of conflicts and conflict resolution. But what we see in terms of the balance sheet of the victims and the survivors of sexual violence, it's even worse because conflicts are getting worse. Sexual violence is used as a strategy in conflicts, and we haven't made any progress there. So where could we cooperate? I'm not against bilateral consultations, but it's kind of, maybe you have better ideas how to drive the agenda forward there. But I think EU and ASEAN could put this on their agenda. And the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where the EU is a full member. It's one of the few Asian organizations where we have full membership, could also put this central stage on the agenda. I'm wondering about ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting, whether it would be a topic to discuss there. My impression from reading a lot of material is that one big issue is funding. How, and this was also actually about the new working group that Germany proposed. One of the concerns was, what do we do with the working group with the ill-defined mandate and no funding guaranteed? So funding is one of the very central things that we have to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. You are also well within the time limit as specified. And thank you for informing us of the various policies that Germany have conducted within this area, and also to highlight how Germany tries to position itself within this EU 27 scope and also the greater international realm. And also we also heard on the various perhaps modes of cooperation between Indonesia and Germany in the years to come to highlight more on this issue. So thank you very much for that, Doctor. And our last speaker for this session, again, is my colleague, Dr. Fitriani, and he will have the space and floor now.
Thank you, Gilang. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for consistently cooperating with CSIS in organizing the German-Indonesia Strategic Dialogue. And I want to say all of my presentation already have been said by Bapak Hari Prabowo and Dr. Gudrun Walker. I need to say that Dr. Gudrun Walker, I was earlier this year has the honor and pleasure to visit your institution, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and I am very, very much, how do I say, amazed with the knowledge and the intellectual discourse that you have, because I think your institution actually provide policy suggestion that actually workable and organized simulation for the policy. So perhaps we can have more discussion later. I would actually continue on from what Dr. Walker has actually shared with us. My focus today would be on women, peace, and security agenda after 2 decades. And it has been said in 2000, it's the first resolution on women, peace, and security that is adopted by the United Nations Security Council. And my structure of the talk would be starts introduction, and then I would share where are we in the progress of women, peace, security agenda. Dr. Walker already said the last resolution was adopted in April, watered down, of course. And but beyond, what can we do beyond? But before we talk about what we're gonna do beyond, I will say what makes women, peace, and security agenda appealing, where everybody can actually contribute something without actually contributing. And the fourth is the convergence, where Indonesia and Germany at, and what can we do beyond the Security Council. I want to actually give history lesson, which is pretty boring. The women, peace, and security was actually started with a paradoxical background. In the beginning, it is actually women are perceived as peaceful. Their action as they're against the war. In the World War I, the World War II, they would say, no to war, end this war. And then, strangely enough, with this framework of women, peace, and security, we actually have this empowerment of women to be everywhere in the security forces, everywhere. Also, not only stopping peace, but also perhaps making war and conflict manageable and also then in the aftermath, how would women have greater role in actually preserving the peace agreement and furthering the peace building effort? What happened was women advocacy at that time was actually torn between they don't really want war, but they need to actually allow women that actually want to contribute to their country the greater ability to contribute, because for the longest time the mainstream ideology is men goes to war to protect the women. It always perceived that women cannot protect themselves, whether that's true or not. And therefore, we have this agenda, women, peace, and security, to actually contribute women from meaningless to meaningful participation. Not only from the boots to on the ground, but also in the decision making, also in the negotiating table. But whether we reach in 2000, whether this process is actually, came from a voluntary realization of the UN. Not really. It's actually an add woman and steer approach. So we heard so much about the peacekeeping effort, and there are excess issues of peacekeeping where actually what would happen when you deploy peacekeeper with US dollar salary per month to a post-conflict area? You get peacekeeper visiting the brothels, let's say. What happened worse was in Cambodia, where actually the government reported the number of brothels increased 400% and the number of HIV spread increased as well. So what actually made a blunder at that time was the special rep of the UN Secretary General for Cambodia mission, Mr. Yasushi Akashi, mentioning that, saying, boys will be boys. And then, oh wow, this is the problem if most of the peacekeepers are men. So let's just add women and steer. But whether this is a very wise approach, I don't think so. And a lot of women and men in the UN said, no, we have to have women in a meaningful number that can make a difference. And then there is created the interconnectivity pillars of the women, peace and security, discussing the issue of women participation, that women can also become the one that protects and also participated in conflict, and therefore they need to be, they need to be invited to the discussion, and not to actually do empowerment without actually discussing what kind of empowerment. And then we have to discuss conflict prevention and negotiation, as well as what happened in the relief and recovery. After 20 years, what happened? There are so many, several already, resolution on women, peace and security. The first time, the resolution 1325 is on addressing the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women. It recognized the undervalued and underutilized contribution of women make in conflict prevention, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and peacekeeping, and peace building. Later on, in 2008, the resolution 1820 was issued. It recognizes sexual violence as a weapon and tactic of war. And 1 year later, in 2009, the resolution 1888 reiterates that sexual violence exacerbates armed conflict and impedes international peace and security, and therefore call leadership to address conflict-related sexual violence, and deploy specific team of experts to engage on the matter. Also in the same year, 2009, the next resolution also encourage women participation in all stages of peace process and call for the indicators of measuring what is women and men participating in empowering women. In 2010, there is a new resolution, Resolution 1960. The new eye-opening or methods utilized is to how to actually do the call for ending sexual violence. Okay, let's do naming and shaming. Who are the peacekeeper doing the sexual exploitation? Which country they are from? Or which country that are not actually allowing women to sit in negotiation table? Let's name and shame them. In 2013, indicator does not go, call for naming and shaming doesn't go. Let's actually talk about operationalizing the obligation, and also talk in a language of women participation, because sometimes maybe women don't know the language of peace and security. Let's approach them and ask, what do you need to actually engage or participate? How could we encourage you to be, for example, a negotiator, to be, for example, peacekeeper, to be, for example, enrolling in the military or in the police forces? And also, the Convention of Elimination of all form of discrimination against women, in the general recommendation in 2013, actually make a connection of the peace, women, peace and security, and the CEDAW. This is actually managed to make women, peace and security is not only enforced or have to be done by countries that is agreed to it. If I can say, in CEDAW, there are more countries signed CEDAW. Indonesia and Germany signed CEDAW. Out of the 194 UN members, 180, around 180 or 90% already ratified CEDAW. And because of the general recommendation of CEDAW to actually interlink women, peace and security, those countries that actually signed and ratified CEDAW actually have to actually implement women, peace and security. They cannot run away now. The last, I'm gonna jump to the 2019. In April, we agreed, and it's already been discussed by Dr. Gudrun Walker, that in April, the resolution 2467 in 2019 is actually recognized that services should also include provision for women with children born as a result of sexual violence in conflict, as well as men and boys, and urge member states to strengthen policy that offer appropriate responses and challenges to cultural assumption to male vulnerability or invulnerability. So I think this is a progress. In the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the latest, it also mentioned men and boys, because sometimes we are weak. And before I go in the convergence between Indonesia and Germany, I want to talk a little bit about what makes the issue of women, peace and security appealing. It is inclusive. It is not only state that can speak about women, peace and security. You allow women organization that usually doesn't have any name to actually, because of the indicators, they can actually see which country have actually already agreed or already have national action plan. They can actually, with the indicator, actually help to measure which country implement, which country does not implement. Is actually inclusive, because with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, research on sex-segregated data actually issued. Actually, because of Women, Peace and Security resolution, the UN released data separately between, how many women peacekeeper we have, how many women peacekeeper in the police, how many women peacekeeper in the military. And before that, before 2000, that data is not available. And that, what I mean is inclusive. And it's also inclusive, even Saudi Arabia, in the discussion of women, peace and security, in 2007 actually talk their commitment in actually on women, peace and security, but they also talk about what they're concerned. The Saudi Arabia joined the area formula, the open debate on women, peace and security, with their issue of discrimination against women, but in occupation area, particularly in Israeli and Palestinian land. So it's really, everybody can have a talk on that. And also Saudi Arabia is committed on the education and advancement of women without actually saying, this is the commitment that we're gonna do. But they just say, oh, we're committed. We see there is a discrimination. And also, it's also a catch-all agenda. Afghanistan, ambassador to the UN actually also say the issue of women, peace and security now also involve violent extremism. And because of that, women should be put front and center in peace building effort and also in countering violent extremism. And also, it's also donor friendly because of the issue of women, is calling easier donor participation rather than, for example, weapon of mass destruction, disarmament, for example, because the population in all countries are equal, men and women. So I think there's no hesitation for all countries to now hopefully endorse and hope to donors. The donors is only 15% of the total in 2015 for the UN effort in furthering women, peace and security. And the UN Secretary General actually asked for more funding to pursue this agenda forward. So I'm gonna go to what's the convergence between Indonesia and Germany. Yes, Dr. Gurdun. Indonesia already have national action plan, but it actually different. It's because national action plan on women, peace and security are tailor-made on the interests and the needs of a country. So Indonesia at that time learning from Aceh experience. And because of that, the focus is more empowering women and children during social conflict. And focus more on the preventive handling, and women empowerment and child participation program. It's not really focused yet on the empowerment of the police forces, not like in the Philippines, for example, and empowerment or minimum threshold for women in the armed forces and the police forces, for example. Meanwhile, in Germany, the focus is already in several pillars: the prevention, participation, protection, reconstruction, preparation, operation, and criminal prosecution. And Indonesia, in the process, grow. We increasingly focus more now on regional. We actually have focus on the countering violent extremism, already shared by Pahadi. We also actually have training for diplomats on women, peace and security in April this year, and it's actually the way how Indonesia mainstream the agenda of women, peace and security in the way that we have done, like for example policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Bahari was actually sharing, as well as Indonesia shared how women in the peacekeeping operation actually can contribute more, actually hopefully in the region, because in ASEAN we have observation mission to Mindanao previously, and in Aceh before we invite regional observant from ASEAN to sort of a regional peacekeeping to actually share with them, with the region on how to increase women, the number of women in peacekeeping efforts. And I I take a look on the German 2017-2020 Women, Peace and Security Agency. It actually have the commitment on the regional and international level. So this is something that I will later perhaps give suggestion in the recommendation. And I think the two issues of areas that haven't been looked at where Indonesia and Germany has sort of convergence is the same issue in refugees and how women in this refugees camp actually need more empowerment. And although the source of refugees are different, they actually perhaps have similar concern. And also how to reform and advance peacekeeping operation to be more effective and covering more protection of civilian, both women and men. And the last slide would be on what should we do beyond United Nations Security Council. I want to offer the loop approach, meaning it's loop approach very Javanese, like attacking the issue, not directly or indirectly. You go loop. Indirectly but persistently. How can we do it? First, we can perhaps, beyond the Security Council, we can raise the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the General Assembly. It's, of course, now part of the CEDAW agenda as well. And there actually have been discussion on women, peace and security in the General Assembly. It was done before. And perhaps, as mentioned by Mr. Jansen K., Germany is in Europe and Indonesia in Southeast Asia. Perhaps we can actually engage through regional approach. Indonesia through ASEAN and Germany through Europe. European Union has Women, Peace and Security Task Force. Germany also part of the NATO. NATO have Armed Forces Gender Meeting. They actually measure in NATO how many % women actually been invited or allowed to be in the armed forces of all NATO's member states. And also in terms of perhaps outside our region, if you have more funding, perhaps that Germany already done, furthering to Africa, African Women Leaders Network, AWNLN, that Germany already funding how women can actually be leading the peace process and negotiation. Perhaps Indonesia can also reach out our Pacific islands. And perhaps we can also attack the issue through bundling with other issues. Also, for example, protection of civilians or discussing the effectiveness of peacekeeping mission. Perhaps adding more women will actually make peacekeeping more effective, and again, CEDAW. And lastly, but not least, is to create synergy, not redundancy. Perhaps we can actually see if we, or perhaps Germany can fund to create a module on women, peace and security training, and Indonesia don't need to fund to make a model. We can actually use the model to do regional training, perhaps. This kind of synergy can be put forward. I hope I don't limit the time. I don't pass the time limit. This is my contact if you want to criticize my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fitri, to elaborate us on the technicalities of the women, peace and security, both at the external level. You mentioned a lot on UN resolution, from the first to the latest, and also on providing us with what the future endeavors could be packaged or could be launched, perhaps, in the future. Now, I'd like to appreciate all of the three speakers now to have provided us with a holistic viewpoint of this issue, and to have spoken within the time limit also, something that I really appreciate a lot, and that we have, if I'm not mistaken now, about 1 hour for discussion, as we will wrap this first session at 11:30. And before I hand it out the mic to the floor for any further questions, I'd like to make my case as the moderator here to perhaps launch a few questions. I have two questions if I can ask to the panelists here, to Dr. Vaka and also Bapak Hari. Maybe I can ask Fitri later during our free time. But I'll limit my questions to the two speakers, if I may. First one to Pak Hari. You've highlighted various policies in Indonesia by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to give greater interest in the issue of gender equity. You mentioned that there's a higher intake of female diplomats, there's a greater role for women in various strategic issues ranging from terrorism into disarmament and peacekeeping operations. And I wonder whether I could ask you to further enlighten us on whether the progresses that we've seen so far are primarily due to the presence of Ibu Retno as our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or whether these policies were already planned regardless of the minister at hand. So that's probably for Pak Hari. And second question to Dr. Wacker. You mentioned Germany's objective to mainstream the issue of gender in the European Union and also in NATO and OECD. And I think Fitri has also already mentioned briefly on the second national plan of Germany beforehand. I'd just like to know whether could you explain the level of resistance that exists within the EU and other regional organizations that you mentioned before on when Germany is trying to mainstream this issue forward. So I think I'll leave my two questions for the speakers there, and I can just ask, maybe I can have for our first round of questions from the floor, maybe two questions first, maybe one from the left and one from the right. So if I can have anyone join me with their questions beforehand, thank you. So I see one hand there and another, perhaps, madam there. So I'll start with Doctor, since it's, yeah.
Just to follow up on your question to Harry Karubo, as to the intake of, incremental intake of more women into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, does the Ministry also have policies to support those women in the various capacities? Does the Ministry also have policies that support women in these capacities? And I understand, I saw that the Echelon 1 intake is about 10%, and I think this is, of course, the important intake. Is there any intention of the Ministry to increase that portion? Thank you.
Thank you. And also the gentleman on the back with the blue cloth, please. You have a question to the panelists? Please come up and come to the closest mic. Thank you. I could also ask for you to identify yourself to the panelists before asking your questions. Thank you.
Has been voicing the women's, and there are a lot of violence in Jakarta itself. According to Komhamnas, about 2,552, and the recent one is happened in the Gokar ones. The women has been thief. Because Pak Hari is mostly on the foreign affair, right? So because the Ministry of Finance also promoting for their exclusive employee for these women, but they only cover just the elected one, so for the original peoples, and there is a media saying like in Asian boss, whether a Germany came here and they go on the street is safe in Jakarta itself. And because we are promoting it international, it's better that we also go to our local, not just the police, maybe also the RT airway, stuff like that. And the second one is there are a lot of women also involved with the terrorist bomb in Indonesia. How this this, this is going to be a challenge for Indonesia wants to, promoting women's for security and peace. And the third one is also maybe, beside that, and in Aceh itself, there are a lot of cases that are women's because of the Sharia law, and they are unruling, they are being, beating the public, not quite, in not quite, in human ways, because they are presented it to the public.
Sorry, Pak Matias, on your first question, you wanted to ask in Jakarta on the elected members of the local government. Is that what you're trying to ask on the first question?
Is what I'm saying is just a lot of this, ministry only promoting only the employee for women's. But when it comes to Jakarta itself, it's like there are a lot of women's in the domestic case. That's still, the number is quite large. The ones that are reported by Komhamnas is about 2,500 for 1 year. So the ones that are not reported because RTRW doesn't know much, they are not coordinating with the police.
Okay, thank you. Okay, maybe I'll stick to that 2 questions, and I'll let the panelists answer the first round of questions first. Maybe I'd like to start from my left. Dr. Baka, would you like to begin answering the question?
It's very simple, because I'm not aware of any resistance. I mean, the EU is built on, certain, already on certain rules and norms and standards. And it's unlike ASEAN, already very homogeneous, so to speak. I mean, there are outliers, depending sometimes on the government elected, and they might want to deviate, but it's not really an issue, and probably you will see that the EU will even take the lead on certain issues. So it's not Germany pushes the agenda and the other sort of, and the same OSCE is probably a little bit different because there are a lot of non-European members there. But I'm not aware that there is a lot of resistance. I found a report by CIPRI in Stockholm about the trends in the EU, OSCE, and UN, but not NATO. So maybe somebody involved in NATO can pick up that question for me, but I think it's not really an issue. The problem is not the rhetoric and the statements, it's really how to implement, how to do practical measures to do that.
Thank you. The first question on whether the progress is primarily due to Ibu Retno. Ibu Retno is definitely a very passionate supporter of women's role, and that includes women's peace and security. The regional training that Dr. Fitri mentioned, the one that we organized in Jakarta in April, that was an ASEAN regional training for future women diplomats. That was entirely Ibu Retno's initiative, and that exemplifies how committed she is on this issue, and she's been speaking on the issue of women, peace and security on many international forums. Having said that, based on my personal observation as staff members of the Foreign Ministry, it didn't start with Ibu Retno. I think at the very least, it already started from Pak Hassan Wirayuda when he reformed the Foreign Ministry. Perhaps colleagues remember that Pak Hassan Wirayuda was also the promoter or the sponsoring official for the establishment of Indonesia's National Human Rights Commission. So Pak Hassan is very influential in injecting and mainstreaming human rights into the work of the foreign ministry, and that includes the role of women. And if we, the table that I showed before, about the proportion of women new recruits, yeah, as compared to their male counterparts. Actually, it already started since at least 2013. The proportion of women, women intake already surpassed male intake. And the next question about whether there is a policy of the foreign ministry to support. Yes, there are a number of policies, and I mentioned several during my presentation, but basically, one, we want to make the foreign ministry a more hospitable place for everyone to work, not only for women, but also for men, but especially there are facilities, provided, bearing in mind the special challenges faced by women in participating at workplace. And for instance, we have a very good childcare service at the office. So parents, whether men or women, they don't have to, they have the comfort of knowing that their children are in the ministry's premises. It's connected with surveillance network, yeah, CCTV, so parents can actually access every time, real time from their own computers, how their kids are doing. Other facilities, especially catered for women, lactation room, that kind of things. Not to mention, what do you call it? Kotak saran. It's like a feedback comment box, things like that. That is Jakarta-based initiative. And of course, being diplomats, another challenge is overseas posting. And this is a very, it can be a very challenging issue, especially for instance regarding to family unity and other aspects. For KEMLU staff who are, so for KEMLU, for couples, married couples who are both KEMLU's officials, for instance, there is a policy for the ministry to try to find the closest possible postings to ensure family union. For instance, if the husband is posted in Singapore, probably the wife will be posted in Kuala Lumpur or that kind of arrangement. It's still, there are more things that we can do, of course, but the willingness is there, the examples are there, and hopefully there will be more and more examples. About how to go beyond staff recruitment, especially to the domestic level. Well, of course, I need to limit my response within the purview of the foreign ministry, but if I can take this opportunity just to remind that the finance ministry has a very good program. I think it's called gender conscious budgeting. So program budgeting for every ministry has to take gender consideration in terms of planning. There are certain parameters for that to ensure that in implementation, their programs will bring impacts to women on the ground. So I think that's how you move your effort beyond the confine of the ministry premises to the people that you serve. Thank you.
Okay, nothing to add? Maybe later? Do you have anything to add for now? No? If you don't, that's okay. I mean, you can have it later. Okay, well, that's for the first round. I'll take 4 now. Maybe I can have Ibu Dewi Fortuna Anwar first, and then the gentleman behind. Doctor, and also I'll decide on one gentleman behind. I can start with Ibu Dewi first, please.
Okay, thank you very much. On this women, peace and security, although the focus is more on the, within the UNSC, clearly this is a much broader agenda. Now, as Fitriani has already clearly out now that women are usually victims, but now they're also as people who can contribute directly to peace, but now increasingly also as perps. Particularly on radicalizations, we have seen clearly that women are becoming also targets to be radicalized and so on. Now, when on discussions of the contribution of women and peace security, we tended to limit ourselves to PKO, and there's always this, there are not enough of them in there because there are not enough in the military, there are not enough of them in the police. But we know that increasingly hybrid operations is not just about peacekeeping, but also reconstruction, reconciliations, peace building, and so on and so forth. I would like to ask all of the panelists, are there sufficient, how far is the discourse? Because I don't see in Indonesia, when we're talking about PKO, it's still limited. The Sun tool, for example, training is still limited to the police and the military. While in fact, what we need is probably more people, and women here have a particular contribution, because according to studies on foreign relations, they can at least play 6 roles in peace. Council of Foreign Relations lists several reasons, that women can work across lines. They tend to be much more collaborative in approaching, and transcending sectarian and other divides. They can act as honest brokers, and they're less ego-bound, much more willing to make compromises. And they can, of course, they can demonstrate, but they can also access critical information where women have access to information where men cannot have. They can have it while collecting waters, while cooking, while attending other gatherings where information might be available, which might not be able to men. So broadening the agenda is also easier, as with women involved, and also aid in post-conflict recovery. But we don't see how this could be translated into real action. What sort of skills will be needed, what sort of activities, that the women will be really engaged in, and who should be engaged in that. So maybe we need to think about how to broaden this agenda, even it was within the UN peacekeeping operations. Really make this hybrid operations truly hybrid, and not just military and police. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Dewi. Bapak Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. Initially, I don't have question, but while talking with Minister Ebers Martin from Munster, it struck in my mind that I have an example about women's roles in peacekeeping and security. When I was still very young, I was stationed in Geneva, and I met with the expert in using chromatographic gas. It's Dr. Marietta Rausio from Finland. She contributes a lot in detecting chemical substance, and qua practice, after that we have also a program of destruction of abandoned chemical weapon, and start in Munster and then have discussion in Cyprus, where Budawi also brought in the Cyprus. And at that time, the role of a woman, it's kind of neglected. But we have to admit that professionally, Marietta Rautio has a very, she is knowledgeable and has a very strong motivation to help to alleviate what is the so-called weapons of mass destruction by using skill. So I think putting women in the landscape of international security is also, we have to take into account by profession, from professional point of view, and by practical. It's a kind of role model. I think that is my opinion, and I'm Iskandar Hadrianto. I'm not representing any institution. I'm just retired and now has occupation as a private consultant. Thank you very much.
Very much, Bapak Iskandar. I have three here. I'll start with General Olshausen. So you have the mic, please.
Thank you very much. All of what I heard was very impressive. But the basic question I have is, we're talking peacekeeping, we're talking reconstruction, we're talking de-radicalization. We are not talking about war and peace enforcement. Because before you can do that all, and war happens, I mean, so the question is, what is the role of the women in peace enforcement? That means war or conflict. And the second point I have, when we look now at the contribution of women in all the areas, let's say in Germany we say 50% because there are 50% women, so everywhere which is important they should be 50%. Are we really convinced that we, with a more collaborative women, would have a more peaceful world if that happens? Question mark?
Thank you, General. I have one gentleman at the back of the room earlier, I think with the one with the dark shirt. Is that you? Yes, could you please come up, introduce yourself, and please have your answers asked. The one at the very back. I think there's one at the very back. Thank you.
So my name is Erlangga from International University Liaison Indonesia. I would like to ask Mr. Hari here. I have two questions. First, is there any strategic position for women in United Nations peacekeeping operations? Because you have said before that there is a lot of women participation, especially in Indonesian United Nations peacekeeping operations. And also, other than just utilizing their soft touch. And then the second question is, what are Indonesian government approach in promoting women, peace and security in the long run, especially for the grassroots citizens? Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Erlangga. And I have one more from General Felder here in the front, please.
Thank you. Rainer Meyer zum Felde. I'm a brigadier general, retired, and I used to work for the German delegation in NATO until 2017, so I can just provide an input on the question from Dr. Gudrun Walker, what is the situation in NATO? Well, the topic women, peace and security is certainly not the top issue in the NATO agenda, but it is an important topic since the alliance is obliged to and committed to really respect and implement this resolution coming from the United Nations as others. I would say in terms of the ratio of females in the alliance, there is a mixed picture. At the top level, we have a Deputy Secretary General, Madam Gottemöller, who is a very strong personality, very influential. At the level of the defense ministers, we have quite a lot of leading defense ministers who are female, including my own one, the German, in the recent years, together with the Dutch, together with the Norwegian, a strong team of powerful women, very much in support of the agenda of NATO, which is on top strengthening deterrence and defense, rather than peacekeeping, enforcement, or things like that, what was the recent agenda. At the level of permanent delegations, the ambassadors, we have very strong female ambassadors in NATO. For example, the British one, for example, the French one, others, Italy and down to Albania. At the level of the military committee, it's quite different, of course. There are actually none of the permanent military representatives female. So overall, according to the situation, a mixed picture. At the military level, I had just last week a meeting in Kiel in our institute where the commander of the 6th US fleet in the Mediterranean was present. And she is female. She is 55 years old, mother of a 12-year daughter, and she commands the 6th US fleet, a key element in the military posture. That is an encouraging situation. On the other side, it will take quite a long time until we are there where you are in your presentations here with your requests for a more balanced representation of females. Last point, NATO is of course very much engaged on the hardcore security business. This is now about great power competition, that is about China and the United States, the impact on the European situation posed by Russian threats, European answers. And in that regard, the focus is very much on other topics than the rather niche, I would say, in a skeptical comment, the rather niche or secondary issues such as that topic, amongst others. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I'll start this round, to answer. I'll start with Dr. Fitriani, if you may so, as I've already instructed. So you have your first order of business. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any question directed to me directly, except for Ibu Dewi, Dr. Dewi Fortunanwar. Thank you for the question. In regard of hybrid peacekeeping, how far is in the discourse? I think Indonesia actually fared very well, because when we talk about peacekeeping and decision making on how to make peacekeeping or the United Nations Security Council more effective, it's the diplomats that are doing. The military, police, they do the war, they do the peacekeeping, but the one that actually concluded the conflict is political willingness, political negotiation, and it is better, I think, to have trainings for women to be leaders as well as diplomats. Unfortunately, the number of women negotiators are still very few. Less than 10% of peace negotiation, maybe now 15% brokered, including women in the negotiation and even signing the peace agreement, or even weapon cessation of shootings. But it is proven that whenever women are present, the peace agreement is more durable. Maybe it say more about how people value life more, because women also often perceived as the weak. And also, if I'm allowed to answer the question of General Klaus Olhausen, women in the, how far is the woman in peace enforcement, in the real type of war, in the war and conflict? We actually need to see the dynamics of war has changed. Previously, World War II is different because they created the planes. Now the dynamics of war is drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber, and I don't think that gender matter much. Of course, already elaborated by General Rainer Meyers as well. Unfortunately, the issue of women, peace, and security actually sidelines, but I don't know whether I would like to quote Francis Fukuyama, 1998 paper, Women and the Evolution of World Politics, the question of whether increasing number of women in the international relation and world politics will actually create a more peaceful world. That paper then received heightened debate from feminists, of course, saying the response is title of paper, you just don't understand. Of course, we see Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, and Indira Gandhi comments war, right? How real is that on women in enforcing conflict and peace? I think both men and women have inclination to actually action, and we see what happened in the US, Abu Ghraib terrorist detention as well. And I think what's important to actually protect the victims. Therefore, in April 2019, the resolution of Women, Peace and Security now sensitize the needs for boys and men also be protected. It's actually protecting the weak and the victims and giving more voice to them. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, to Dr. Dewi, I fully agree with you, Bu, that we need to go beyond female peacekeeper, and that is what we are doing at the moment, while trying to improve the proportion and role of our female peacekeeper. At the same time, we also try to see other possible aspects where we can play a role in women, peace, and security. One of the example was what Dr. Fitri mentioned before, the ASEAN regional training on women, peace, and security. The participants were actually not female peacekeepers, but young female diplomats from ASEAN countries, plus Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. So the idea is to start an effort towards having a pool of female negotiators in the future. So it's just the start of a continued process where the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, in cooperation with other ASEAN foreign ministries, try to build up the capacity of ASEAN female diplomats so that in the future, when there are cases, situations that require peace negotiators, we have more female diplomats in capacity to do so. Another example, actually, many of these, our initiatives on WPS are conducted with partners from European countries. We mentioned before on the 5th of July, we'll be having a focus group discussion in Berlin. That's also on the issue of women, peace, and security. Before, about 2 weeks ago, we had a discussion with the Belgium Foreign Ministry and also with the European Union External Affairs Services on enhancing civilian capacity of peacekeeping. So that goes to your point, Ibu Dewi, about peacekeeping is go beyond peacekeeper, but also comes with other, construction, medicine, and so on. And this is where civilian capacity can play a role. And now we are basically forging partnership with other like-minded countries, trying to find possible breakthrough in the future. De-radicalization, yes, again, that is a very important issue for Indonesia. Very important to the point that for the next presidency of the UNSC next year, in September, we are thinking of taking the main theme of counterterrorism and combating violent extremism. As Indonesia, we are keen to advance what we call a comprehensive approach on this issue, combining hard approach with soft approach. We have numerous lessons learned on how women in various parts of Indonesia take a leading role in promoting moderation, in refusing violence, like Sister Brigita in Maluku. Another success story in Aceh, I'm trying to remember her name. I remember her name 5 minutes ago, but now I'm blank, I'm sorry. But there are success stories where female, Indonesian female, they make a difference in promoting tolerance, and by doing so, contributing to ending the conflicts. Although in our case, it's not international armed conflicts, it's more like a domestic social conflicts, yeah? But the lessons learned can be valuable for other areas as well. And a strategic position for Indonesian women in peacekeeping operation. If what you meant was UNDPKO, unfortunately at the moment we don't have any female high-ranking official at the UNDPKO. However, we are very proud because I think this is for the first time. One of Indonesian female eminent person has reached the rank of Under Secretary General, Executive Secretary of UNSCAP in Bangkok, Ibu Armida Ali Syahbana. So for the first time in history, we have an Indonesian national serving as USG, Under Secretary General of the United Nations, particularly as the #1 person in UNSCAP Bangkok. She happens to be a female, and we are very proud of this achievement. Indonesia's approach in promoting WPS in the long run, domestically, we are trying to sensitize this issue with domestic stakeholders. The role of think tanks like CSIS, of course, is very important. Of course, we need to work hard with other agencies as well. But you know, being foreign ministry, what is not less important for us is, of course, how we can promote this agenda further. And I think you mentioned that beyond UNSC, but also bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, regionally, again, the example of ASEAN Women, Peace and Security Training, which we are planning to do as an ongoing process. But also, I think the issue of refugees came up in our discussion, and I think not many people know that, for instance, in February this year, Indonesia held a capacity building training program for female refugees, Palestinian female refugees who live in refugee camps. As you understand, you know, living in female refugee camp, they have no certainty for their future. And this training program is aimed specifically to female refugees, trying to equip them with capacity, with economic and entrepreneurship capacity to build small and micro economic enterprises, so that even though they live in refugee camps, hopefully they can do start-up businesses and they can achieve economic independence and live in dignity even in the worst situation. So that is another example of how Indonesia implement the concept of women, peace and security on the ground. Of course, we are open for cooperation and partnership with all like-minded member states. And I think, you know, this kind of forum is very important to exchange ideas on other possible initiatives that we can promote. Thank you.
Okay, I start by saying we should stay away from gender stereotypes, that women are more peaceful or something like that. I mean, that's not the case, and I think the examples that have been cited, female combatants in terrorist groups, I think this is also one of the problems we now have with repatriation, that there are women who joined deliberately ISIL, and now they're coming back with their children, or they want to come back, and how to deal with that, and how to come up with programs to de-radicalize them. So this is an issue, and clearly it's not that women by nature are more peaceful or something, but I think the basic assumption of this whole women, peace and security agenda is that women are victims they are mostly civilian victims of conflicts and victims of war where they never even participated. So that's the starting point with the whole thing. And the other thing where we shouldn't have a stereotype, yes, of course, women can have the same skills and the same professional knowledge and everything. And the question is not, can women do mathematics or, you know, non-proliferation or understand nuclear weapons? The question is, why don't they go in these professions? And how can we promote that women really do that? And I come from from a country where international security is a very suspect topic anyway, because, you know, of our history and all that, not to mention for women. In my institute, in the year 2000, 2001, I was the only female head of a division, and there were maybe 5% female academics. And then there was a time in 2015 when of 8 research units, 7 had female heads. So something has changed, clearly. And it's also a generational thing, I assume, that, you know, more women are more easy accepted. But what we heard about NATO basically reflects what is going on in our societies as well. So at the top level, it's sort of thin, the share of women is thin. Look at universities, etc. Because in Germany, at least, I would say it's still because women who have a child, their career is somehow interrupted and it's hard to get back. So more is needed there. And then at the middle levels, already things are going on. But if I look, for example, at female leaders in Asia, if you look very closely, sometimes it's more a matter of dynasty building than actual, you know, making a political career by yourself. So we always have to be careful with this kind of stereotypes. I mean, the agenda is also not about whether women are good in a war situation. I actually agree. The nature of war is changing, and it doesn't matter who operates a drone, whether that's a man or a female, they will both in the end have the same post-traumatic stress syndrome from doing that. But I think after the conflict, if we talk, for example, about a survival-centered approach, women can get better access to the victims because they will probably, if they're traumatized by sexual violence, they are not very likely to open up to the perpetrator gender, right? So that's all we're saying. One thing about Germany, I think a lot has improved because Germany has a center, it's called the Center for International Peace Operations, and their agenda, actually they're housed in our institute, they're our direct neighbors, so we have very close contact. And I think in Germany now they raised the share to 39%, which is pretty good. So they offer special training courses. They have come up with sort of a handbook with guidelines addressing the gender issues. So I think training and educating women and bring them into, you know, this whole field. This is the best practical way forward I can think of.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vaca. We have about, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 plus more minutes we have, and I think I'll just take 2 questions, one from each side. I haven't seen anyone asking from this side at the very back row. If there aren't any, then I'll take 2 from here. I'll take 1 from the very back row, gentleman with the gray blazer, and I'll take 1 from the gentleman with the blue shirt here. So, oh, then the one woman. I'll take 3 then, and I'll take Gustika as well. I'll start with you then. Gustika, can you? Yes. Can you please introduce yourself as well? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gustika, so I'm an intern at CSIS, but I'm also a youth advisor for UNFPA Indonesia. So basically what I want to ask, I was very interested in all of your presentations, but how do you actually specifically mention that policies on women often trickle down to children? So I was wondering, in the modules that Indonesia and Germany has in training their peacekeepers, is there anything specific on children and comprehensive sexual education or against sexual violence? Because oftentimes the perpetrators are also children, so I feel like it needs a different approach. And also, is there any sort of prevention strategies. Like for instance, the UN has the PSEA, the Prevention on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, it's targeted for higher and basically people on the ground who have positions in the UN. So I was wondering if Indonesia and Germany has something similar. Thank you.
Thank you, Gusika. The gentleman with the blue shirt, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I just want to, my question will be addressed
Could
to...
you please introduce yourself?
Okay, fine. My name is Sahrudin. I'm from Banten. My question will be addressed to Ms. Fitriani. Yeah, we just finished the election. Thanks God we are finished the election. Now, how you see emak-emak melek politik in Indonesia? Women in politics in Indonesia, especially emak-emak, I mean a mother, because I see it's like worse. So I just want to know your opinion as a woman, as maybe mother, about that issue. And the second question to Ms. Gundrun from Germany, I want to know also the big difference between German woman and Indonesian woman or Asian woman in general. Thank you.
Thank you for the 2 questions. Okay, the gentleman at the back with the gray blazer, please come up and introduce yourself before you raise your questions.
Good morning. My name is Japra. I'm from Ravenhill Group. To address the such insight from the announcement, Mr. General, regarding the nature of with the women's participations within the women peace and security itself is not really well. It's not. I'm not saying that it's not efficient, but it will be okay. The nature of war is changing as stated by the Ibu Fitri, but what's the end game? What's the plan of actions that we would like to implement in the post-conflict areas, and how we able to encourage all the female, not only the actors, but also all the related parties to able to reconcile from the post-conflict perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. 3 sharp, concise questions from the floor. I'll start before I hand out to the panelists. Perhaps all the speakers, aside from answering the questions, could also present slight conclusion to what you have presented all the morning. Maybe in total, I'll give you about 3 until 5 minutes. I'll start with Dr. Vaka, if you may.
Okay, thank you. The children, I don't think that the new resolution addresses children as perpetrators in conflicts, like we see in some African conflicts, for example. But what is explicitly there is more bringing the topic to the central stage, that there are a lot of children that are born as a result of sexual violence. So if there is no access to services, reproductive services, then these children are born and in their own societies they are not accepted, they're discriminated against, the mothers are stigmatized. So this is a topic that is very explicitly addressed in the new resolution text, and actually I think there will be one of the provisions within the resolution is that there will be a report of the General Secretary of the UN on the situation of these children 2 years from now. So I cannot say anything about children as perpetrators, but it's an issue. The difference between German women and Asian or Indonesian women, I mean, I said we should stay away from stereotypes. So I don't have an answer to that. That it will be really satisfying to the person who asked the question. we do have different cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds. Germany is it's a very European nation, and gender equality has been on the agenda for a long time, or is part of our constitution, but that doesn't mean we cannot improve. And as I said, it's also a generational thing, and how you are socialized. I mean, I'm the older generation now, as much as I deplore that, but I grew up with different norms than girls today, and for what is normal in terms of access for girls today was not normal to me. So there is also an evolution, and I think there is an evolution in Indonesia going on as well. But I think, despite the fact that I said the world will not be better if it's ruled by women, I think that women have something to contribute, and they can bring something on the table. I don't know where these statistics come from, that if women participate in the negotiation of peace treaties, for example, or conflict resolutions, they are more, the resolution or the solution will be more sustainable than if women are excluded from the table. I don't know how fat the basis for this sort of empirical studies is, but it's out there, and I think this is one of the things that we need to keep in mind. And as for the general conclusion, I think we heard some good suggestions where to cooperate, and I think practical training of women, and trying to figure out the specifics of how to deal with certain situations, and make it possible that women participate more, and that is the best way to go. Because as I said, at the rhetorical level, everybody agrees that we want peace and stability and welfare, but how to get there is you can only do with small practical steps.
About training modules for peacekeepers, perhaps I should start by sharing my observation that one distinct feature of Indonesian peacekeepers is their inclination and even enthusiasm to engage the local communities. So our peacekeepers, whether they are from TNI or from Polri, they are very inclined not to just be confined with the mandates as stipulated in the relevant UNSC resolutions, but they also want to actually contribute to the local communities. One of the reasons for this is because of the legacy of the DWI function of our military, which has been, embedded into the working culture of the military and the police. How our military go to remote areas and help the development in those remote areas. So actually many of our peacekeepers, they go beyond peacekeeping, but also becoming early peace builders. That is one of the often used terms. A function that has been actually been welcomed by many. And in doing so, even they managed to accomplish family reunification. I don't know, many of you probably followed what Ibu Retno mentioned as part of her speech during the open debate on peacekeeping. She gave an example of Major Gembong, an Indonesian peacekeeper in the DRC, who managed to facilitate family reunification for no less than 422 combatants, former combatants. Now, this in implementing this, perspective, more and more we realize that such functions actually can be implemented more effectively and more fully by female peacekeepers for various reasons that have been raised during our discussion today. Female peacekeeper can provide better comfort for those still traumatized by conflicts among each other. So, and this kind of community engagement is already embedded as part of the module for our peacekeepers. Now, there are ongoing projects try to further refine these modules into, female or male. But again, at the end of the day, actually both female and male peacekeepers, they have to meet and surpass the same criteria. So having tailor-specific, tailor-made modules for peacekeeper doesn't mean, one category is being specialized and therefore under probably less parameters than others. No, the parameters to start with should remain the same. And the community engagement has been part of our module. It has been proven to be particularly effective for female peacekeepers, and this is what we want to sharpen and to refine in the future. Another important aspect here is the spirit to have more female peacekeepers is shared not only by us at the Foreign Ministry, but we are pleased to note that this is shared by all stakeholders that are involved in the planning and dispatching of our peacekeepers, including the military and the police force themselves. The meeting in Berlin on the 5th of this coming Friday, for instance, part of our delegation is a female peacekeeper from the police. So we hope by bringing a female peacekeeper to the FGD in Berlin, the discussion can be more needs-based, based on actual conditions on the ground, because she is the practitioner. Perhaps because Pak Gilang asked to give kind of short concluding remarks. Women, peace and security, I think, is a very multi-dimensional issue. That is what we need to understand. It goes beyond, as I think Ibu Dewi mentioned, it goes beyond female peacekeepers. The starting point, of course, is the starting point that triggered this agenda is, of course, the fact that women and children are often disproportionately affected by wars and conflicts. As time progresses, more and more dimensions and aspects of women's role in peace process have become more better understood, both as a victim, both as early peace builders, both as mediators, female peacekeepers. So even though the agenda of WPS is soon to be 20 years old, but it seems to me there are so many more aspects to be developed, to be discussed, not to mention about operationalization. We in Indonesia probably now is at the early stage of operationalizing this concept, not only domestically, but also at the regional level and possibly at the international level. So I think this is an exciting phase in the WPS agenda, and we need to bring it not beyond UNSC, as you mentioned, but at all aspects of international relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Safruddin from Banten, my comment about emak-emak politik or women in politics. Who is this emak-emak? It's a domestic question in international settings, but I think we need to address this. Why? Because foreign policy is made at home. I think it's premature to discuss how Indonesia and Germany can collaborate in the level of women, peace and security without actually we learn from each other country of history of women empowerment. I was in late 2000 in Germany learning about how Germany incorporate or include women in its armed forces. Previously, the German constitution does not allow women to work in the occupation that bear arms, what I think German people here know the history more. And I take that as a successful story, how the German managed to change the regulation to include women in all sectors of the armed forces. I return to Indonesia and say, oh, Germany can do it. Let's Indonesia do it as well. I got, and then, oh yeah, and then I got this resistance, your first question. Oh yeah, how many years have they done it? 10 years. Is there any big changes? Yes, the position is open, but number of women enrolling is still small. And then in Indonesia Defense University, I faced this question. Okay, if you want to do a campaign of changing the policy for Indonesia to allow women to enter all sectors in the armed forces, can you do it? Because in Germany, they try to do it, the number is still small. In Indonesia, women are still barred to the roles that goes in the front line, to say. Okay, so I think what is the politic of emak-emak? Please come to my lecture on gender and Indonesia, women empowerment in Indonesia. Just like other ASEAN countries, we are hesitant to use the word feminism because it's too Western. But I think we need to learn how women are being empowered in Indonesia. Previously, in the struggle of independence, women are the sidekick of Cut Nyak Dien. Although legitimate as she is, she's fighting with her husband. Christina Martatiahahu fight in the side of her father. They are prominent because they are women, and you can see that they are different from the rest. Then Indonesia have Indonesia Women Congress, and then after gaining independence, Sukarno, this the same as other developing countries, gained independence in the 1940s, 1960s, actually encourage women to help country development. What happened at the time, the Indonesia women movement actually perceived as too frontal. They want exactly what we have currently. Daycare in the office so women can go to work. But at that time, the men that just finished fighting, they want to go back to non-soldiering job, and they fight the job with women. What happened was Indonesia women movement are perceived close to PKI, Communist Party. And therefore, when the communists, it was a Cold War. See how domestic and international relation collides. And when the communists were eradicated, goes along the Indonesia women movement. And we have the New Order president that actually do put women as the side of the men with Dharma Wanita and how women have to support their men in the office. Okay, the New Order changed in 1998. We have the Reformasi era. We saw the increase of female bureaucrats. Actually, there's a paper written on it. They say Indonesia already entered the Femocrat era. How women actually managed to enter the ministries, and they gained success. But exactly now, we actually facing the backlash. Why? Because they are segregated between women that is privileged. They can gain education, they can get into the ministry, but women in the grassroots, that's why we have so many questions, I think, on what are we doing for women that is common. And actually with the increase of conservatism, the role of women in public sphere is decreasing. In CSIS conduct research published in Kompas by Nuri Oktariza, my colleague, to see the lowering number of women enrolling or participating in the local election 2018. This is because the conservatism, the increase of using religion as a platform to do campaign, and politicians use religion houses, khutbah Jumat, Friday prayer, to do lecturings. And women are not having access to this. And then when we go now in the emak-emak entering politics, this is just the same reasoning that we see how women with a little bit of space here in politics, they want to be seen, but they are used as well. which which women are in politics? Are we give voice to all ama-ama? How about if women that are too busy working, they cannot participate in politics? Do we do something about it? I guess I would also, for my concluding remark, before actually collaborating more closely with the German in terms of women, peace and security, I think it's good to learn from Germany, because I don't know the history of women empowerment in Germany, and to against stereotyping. We need to come out with specific solution for specific problems and no one size fit all. Thank you.
Well said conclusion from all of our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the conclusion of our first session. I'd like to thank the three panelists who have shared with us their profound knowledge. And my appreciation also goes to the active participation of our wonderful audience this morning. Let's raise our hands and give appreciation for the completion of the first session. So. Now I hand the mic back to the MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all panelists who have given us new insights on the matter. Next, we will proceed to our second panel on mainstreaming awareness on the climate change conflict nexus. This discussion will be moderated by Dr. Puspa Delima Amri, Assistant Professor of the Department of Economics at Sonoma State University, who is also a visiting fellow at CSIS. To Dr. Puspa, time and place is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ambassador Schley has already joined us over here, so I'd like to also invite Dr. Mambunan as the other panelist to please join us also up here, if he is ready. Good morning, everybody. My name is Puspa Amri. I am an assistant professor of economics at Sonoma State University, currently at CSIS as a visiting fellow, and I am currently working on the public perception towards environmental issues, including climate change issues. As such, I'm very grateful for the organizers to be included in this panel, and we have an excellent lineup of speakers to speak to us today, share their knowledge about the nexus between climate change and conflict. Now, the importance of climate change as a socio-economic issue needs no further underscoring, in my view. We've already seen rising sea levels affecting development in the world. We've seen entire villages, such as that in Kiribati, displaced, and we've also seen that people in Indonesia itself have been worried that rising sea levels in Jakarta and around the Banten area are affecting the livelihood of not only the people there, but also businesses, as well as the ways of lives and how this can continue. So therefore, with the current position of Indonesia and Germany as members of the non-permanent UN Security Council, I echo the message that is formed by the organizers of this panel, which is we should probably ask ourselves how Indonesia and Germany can cooperate together to talk about what are the issues that are important regarding climate change, and in particular, what is to be done about the potential human or displacement effects that can happen due to these threats emanating from climate change. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and let me introduce to you the first speaker for this session. We have with us Ambassador Anne-Marie Schleich. She started her career with the German Foreign Service in 1979, and from 2012 to 2016, she was the German ambassador to New Zealand and 7 Pacific Island states. So therefore, given her extensive experience in the Asia-Pacific and Oceania area, I think she will have very interesting views to share regarding the topic at hand. Without further ado, let me invite Ambassador Schleich. Please, the floor is yours. Perhaps we will take approximately 15 to 20 minutes, Ambassador, and then we'll move. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And I also would like to thank CSIS and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for organizing yet another very topical bilateral dialogue. Well, environmental agreements, international climate security. Since the historic summit, UN summit in Stockholm in 1972, the topics of environmental protection and later of climate change have been very much on the international agenda. We have also witnessed a growing participation of non-governmental organizations. But only very recently, the nexus between climate change and security has come into the multilateral limelight. So today, Today I would like to focus first on the architecture of environmental agreements and the question of civic society involvement. Secondly, I want to see whether small countries that are not members of the Security Council can influence multilateral negotiations. And thirdly, I will briefly talk about how Germany promotes the topic of climate change during its current term as an elected member of the Security Council. And lastly, I would like to turn to the question whether the ongoing protests of young people could result in any action, more strict action by governments. Let me, in all necessary briefness, take you through these various agreements, their stepping stones, and I would like to highlight the major achievements of these environmental landmark agreements. Well, it's a story of prolonged negotiations, of compromises, of discussions, of pulls and pushes, and of course also of a bit increased civil society engagement. The Stockholm Conference 1972 focused world attention on a single issue, the global environment. One of its achievements was the creation of the iconic UN Environment Programme, UNEP. That one has become a very powerful UN institution which coordinates international environmental action. Later, 15 years later, the World Commission on Environment and Development published in 1982 the Brundtland Report, which demanded more sustainable development. And in the same year, the Montreal Protocol is considered to be one of the most successful environmental treaties. It was designed to phase out CFC gases. Companies and governments acted unusually fast upon the advice of the scientific community. And as a result, the ozone-depleting substances were decreased and ozone holes were reduced or at least stabilized. NGOs lobbied governments, raised public awareness, and endorsed the use of more environmentally friendly alternatives. The Rio Summit, 20 years later, the focus of it was on balancing environmental policies, economic growth, and social equality. One of its major achievements was the establishment of the historic United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. UNFCCC was meant as a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases. You can see the other 3 important Rio conventions which were also founded at the Earth Summit. The strong involvement of environmental NGOs was an important factor in the constructive outcome at Rio. The Kyoto Protocol sent, again, 10 years, 12 years later, it set binding emissions reduction targets. A novel feature was placed because a heavier burden was placed on industrialized countries under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Countries were supposed to meet their respective targets through national measures. Developing countries such as Brazil, India, China were exempted from emissions reductions. And a number of compromises were needed to get the climate skeptical countries on board. The US Senate, however, never ratified it, and Canada withdrew in 2011. The Kyoto Protocol was an important first step towards emission reductions by individual countries, but it had shortcomings. The time is too brief for me to outline them. During and after the Kyoto negotiations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, played a key role due to their strengthened global information network. They put, again, pressure on negotiators, lobbied their respective governments to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Agreement was based actually on the Kyoto Protocol. It set out to reduce the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2%. Each country had to determine and report on its contributions to mitigate global warming. So far, 195 countries have ratified it, and unfortunately the US has announced its withdrawal in 2017. The Paris Agreement has been criticized because the commitments are non-binding and enforcement mechanisms are somewhat lacking. Conference of the Parties, COP21, witnessed a record number of over 7,000 NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. And during the Paris negotiations and the following COPs, NGOs gave inputs to move the environmental agenda forwards. Let me talk about how, apart from NGO engagement, how small countries, even if they are not members of the Security Council, can influence climate negotiations. And I would like to take the example of the South Pacific Island countries. To the right of Australia and to the north of New Zealand, you see the 14 South Pacific Island countries. We have some facts about the South Pacific Island countries. You see the very large exclusive economic zone and the very large land area that they have. So all 14 South Pacific countries share similar problems such as small populations, limited resources, limited access to international markets, vulnerability to rising sea levels, lengthening droughts, and increased cyclone activity. We also observe an overdependence on fossil fuels, an exploitation of natural resources, and these developments pose developmental, environmental, and safety problems for the small countries. Here you see a photo of one of the capital of Kiribati, pronounced Kiribati, North Tarawa, which is home to 50,000 people. And here you see one of the fishing vessels in Fiji, which floated into the harbor wall during a sea search. And here you see, Anote Tong, the former president of Kiribati, who became an international celebrity for the effects of climate change. Anote Tong was the one who talked about climate refugees. He knows what he's talking about. He said climate change really threatens the existence and livelihood of our population. Tong also called for a paradigm shift where the Pacific needs to chart its own course and leads global thinking in crucial areas such as climate change. So one of the possibilities for South Pacific countries was to voice that topic in the regional forum, which is the Pacific Island Forum. It's a key union of 14 countries which organize themselves and cooperate on political, trade, and cultural issues. After decades of focusing on regional integration, PIF, as I now call it, has become a strong advocate for climate change issues. Its new focus is now on the Blue Pacific. During its annual meetings, it has raised climate change topics with its 18 Pacific Island Forum partners. Among them is Indonesia, is Germany, the US, and China. A large part of last year's PIF Head of Government meeting in Nauru was devoted to climate change, disaster resilience, and the viability of the region's fishery resources. And 2 months ago, for the first time, the PIF heads of governments hosted UN Secretary General Guterres in Fiji. Guterres stated during the visit, "The Pacific voice," I quote, "is loud and clear. Climate change cannot be stopped by small islands alone. It is enlightened self-interest from all decision makers around the world, because it's not only the Pacific that's at stake, it's the whole world." Another forum is the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States. It has 52 members and territories, and among them 22 South Pacific Island countries. It's a UN body. And the third SIDS conference 4 years ago in Samoa resulted in the adoption of a Small Island Development States Accelerated Modalities of Action. Sorry, quite a mouthful. It's called the Samoa Pathway. And they also announced 300 multi-stakeholder partnerships. 7 of the 14 goals in that partnership refer to climate change and environmental problems. And during the upcoming session this month of the UN Political Forum of the SIDS states in New York, the SIDS states will present their national reviews and progress on sustainable development goals. The German Foreign Office, by the way, hosted a side event last year during the last conference of the parties in Poland, and it highlighted the security risks arising from climate change. The presidency of Fiji of the 23rd Conference of the Parties, the COP23, in 2017 was a highlight of South Pacific countries' engagement. Germany assisted Fiji in the organization and hosted the over 30,000 participants in Bonn. Fijian Prime Minister Bainimarama effectively presided over the proceedings and projected the concerns of the South Pacific countries. Fiji was also behind the establishment of the so-called Talanoa dialogue, which is Fijian word for an inclusive dialogue. And that dialogue provided input from stakeholders and expert institutions during the preparatory phase for the COP. Climate change has become more prominent on the agenda of the UN Security Council, with a focus on vulnerable small island developing countries, the SIDS states. And in January this year, the Security Council held an open debate on security implications of climate-related disasters, improved warning systems, climate risk management, mitigation measures were the main issues debated in January. UN Secretary General Guterres has convened a summit of world leaders for this September in New York. The motto is, "A race we can win, a race we must win." The summit wants to challenge states, cities, companies, investors to step up action, especially on their nationally determined contributions. And South Pacific Island countries played a decisive role in the lead up to this very special UN summit. To sum up this new Pacific diplomacy, South Pacific Island countries have, to some extent, managed to overcome their internal regional and sub-regional divisions. They coordinated their environmental positions, and thus they increased their voice in global institutions and on the international scene. Let me briefly look at Germany. Germany has made the nexus between climate change and security one of its main features during its Security Council tenure. It has been one of the long-time supporters of the Pacific Island countries with bilateral and EU assistance. You see the figure, approximately 130 million euros during the years 2013 and 2019. The German Development Agency, GIZ, has assisted with adaptation to climate change programs and other environmental programs. And I already mentioned Germany's financial and technical support for Fiji during its COP23 presidency. Germany has also assisted the Marshall Islands with organizational financial help when the Prime Minister of Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine, convened a so-called virtual climate summit. And it was virtual because 48 countries, developing and developed countries, met on screen only, and thereby set an example to reduce their conference carbon footprint. The results of this Pacific-inspired Talanoa dialogue fed into the UN climate round in Poland in December last year. This year, Germany was the first country which pledged to double its contribution to replenish the Green Climate Fund, $1.7 billion US. And in August 2018, Germany and Nauru co-initiated a group of friends on climate and security. As a follow-up, a climate and security conference in Berlin was opened in June, just a month ago, by the German foreign minister and the president of Nauru. Its so-called wake-up call, the Berlin call for action, increased the momentum for climate action ahead of the upcoming UN Climate Summit in September. International climate change, is it possibly a failure? Ladies and gentlemen, we're looking back to almost half a century of global environmental conferences, climate conventions, NGO engagement. However, the latest environmental data show an increase in greenhouse gases, a rise in ocean temperature, an increasing pollution of oceans, melting of glacier ice, an ever-growing deforestation, and a massive loss of habitat and biodiversity. As a consequence, grassroots protests and civil disobedience movements have come up, such as you have heard about it, the Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion Civil Disobedience Group campaign as well. Here's one of the photos that you may have seen already. With their grassroots activism, they represent a fundamentally different approach to the one that NGOs used. Another development is the unexpectedly high number of votes for environmentally friendly green parties during the recent elections for the European Parliament in May 2019. So we are observing a mounting public discontent and impatience about insufficient actions of national governments. It's a wake-up call for governments and for the UN institutions to act upon them. As Secretary General Guterres recently said about climate activism, my generation has failed to respond properly to the dramatic challenge of climate change. This is deeply felt by young people. No wonder they are angry. Momentum is building, and there's a new determination to unleash the promise of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, I foresee that the UN Summit on Climate in September might provide the opportunity to act upon the challenge which young people have presented us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sly. To introduce our next speaker, let me say a few words. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Sony Mumbunan, who is an economist and a research scientist at the Research Center for Climate Change at the University of Indonesia. He's been long involved in academic research on adaptation and policies in response to climate change. He's worked also in various international organizations and at units within the government. And may I also add, he has his PhD in economics from the University of Leipzig. So I believe he's an appropriate speaker to share his views with us today. Please, Dr. Mumpunan, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to CSIS, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to share some of the ideas about sort of the Indonesian context in relation to a global context in areas of climate change. Ja. Ich konnte eigentlich meinen Vortrag auf Deutsch halten, aber damit die anderen Kollegen folgen können, dann mache ich auf Englisch. So I've been requested to share some of the response of Indonesia toward the climate agreement. I'll go a bit deeper into how it is being operationalized in Indonesia and show some of the results. So I will focus on on two areas. Ambassador Sly has mentioned the nationally determined contribution, which emerged in prominence during the COP in Paris in 2015. And going into the national level is on the midterm development planning we know as RPJMN, which for the first time in the country's history adopts strategic environmental assessment, what we know as, at least Indonesia's low carbon development initiative. I will make a transitional note between the two, between the NDC and Indonesia's RPJMN, just to provide more context that the Paris Agreement requires that parties, member states like Indonesia, to undertake and then accommodate a more ambitious efforts for emission reductions. So the NDC is part of Indonesia's commitment, and we have submitted the first NDC to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. In Indonesia, in October 2016, we have also ratified with a law. So it's quite high in terms of regulatory framework. It is a law, Undang-Undang nomor 16 tahun 2016. Nomor 16 tahun 2016. So this is the Indonesia's NDC. Sorry for just some number just too small, but basically it presents Indonesia intention to reduce emissions with and without international support. Within Indonesia's effort, it will reduce 29% against baseline in 2010, and with international support, it can be up to 41%, so additional 15%. In the discussion, we call it, the unconditional, so the 29% reduction, and conditional upon international support with the 41%. So we have the NDC. Indonesia has responded to this, and how it is being translated. The NDCs, again, apologies for the small size of the fonts, but it is structured around different sectors. So land-based sectors, agriculture, forest, and so on and so forth, peatland, of course, energy, waste, and industrial processing. Each of the emission reduction contribution is also spelled out in NDCs and some potential measures. But these are largely biophysical, sort of ideas. One sectors reduce some amount or percentage of emission. It doesn't consider the effect on economic growth, for instance, or the effect or impacts on poverty reduction or poverty addition. So this is, again, as mentioned, is largely a biophysical model, and the discussion that follows or it brings is also on biophysical model and policy discussion. Now I will invite you to go to a more integrated, approach where, social, economic, and technological, to some degree also institutional arrangement are also integrated into the way emission reduction is being assessed. It is part of the Indonesian Ministry of Planning, Bappenas, supported by partners. GIZ has also supported this exercise, so there are different partners, but it is institutionalized within the Ministry of Environmental Planning. So this is not a research, this is not an intellectual exercise, this is a policy in the making, and it will inform Indonesia's forthcoming midterm development planning, or RPJMN for 2020-2024. This is one of the sort of the flagship, the main findings. There are different low carbon development scenarios. The lowest one is so-called the base case. If we do nothing, business as usual, the way it is. And there are different scenarios going up with different level of ambitions. We call it, in the report, call it moderate scenario or high carbon, low carbon scenarios. And on the top, the most top of it is low carbon development plus scenarios. So we can see in this slide is about economic growth. So the GDP trajectory, it is up to 2045. So quite a long modeling estimation. It expects that we can have, higher economic growth at a sustained time period. But as you can see, almost all scenarios in the end will, up to a certain point, will go down. I'll come back to that part later on. If we reflect the findings into emission reductions, again, baseline, we have different emission reductions potential under different scenarios. So we have the base case, up of the figure, and the more ambitious the scenario is, like LCDI plus, and we see the more emission reductions that Indonesia potentially have. The other scenarios still go up, so more or less following the base case, only the LCDI scenarios going into somewhat different direction than the other scenarios. The implications are, of course, non-negligible. I'll come back to that later on. Another differences with the NDC and the so-called LCDI under the midterm development planning is it sees climate change as a system. So it is part of Indonesia's aspiration for economic growth, emission reduction, biodiversity loss, tackling biodiversity loss, marine pollution to some degree, and so on and so forth. If we map using some of the targets or goals under SDGs, we can put different in different areas. So this is the exercise going on at the moment with within Bappenas with the support of other ministries. So the numbers that we some of which are presented here are also coming from these integrated exercise. Let me pick one of the scenario, high CDI scenarios. For instance, we can maintain 6% economic growth over time, preventable 40,000 preventable deaths because of pollution, and so on and so forth. So these are climate potential benefits that we can brought up through some of the mitigation and adaptation options. Sorry. So the final slide, because it's about conflict and climate, I'd like to make a reflection. When it comes to climate change, sea level rise, the first reflect is Indonesia's position as the largest archipelagic state. Excellency Ambassador Frau Sly has mentioned some of the constellation also at the global level. But allow me to, given time interest, to focus on somewhat different than that. In the semantics of UNFCCC, it is known as response message. It is not explored in Indonesia. It is often overlooked, not discussed, but this is very, very significant, very, very important. What it is how we respond to, say, climate policies and how it impacted jobs, poverty, and so on and so forth, that in turn may also impact climate migration or conflicts, the rise of radicalism, and so on and so forth. In Indonesia, what we've been discussing is, for instance, when we have a regulation on peatland, where some concession can no longer operate or make economic activities on peatland, what happens to the jobs because of the introduction of climate-related regulation? These have not been properly discussed. These are largely overlooked. And once we have the policy and labor union strikes back, they oppose the policy, we have a policy that cannot be implemented. Same observation can also be made for coal, for instance. And about coal, Germany has a lot to share, how difficult it is to deal with coal plants, for instance. So this is a reflection that I would like to raise in this occasion. Thank you for listening. Terima kasih.
Excellent. I'd like to thank again Dr. Mumbunan and Ambassador Sly for their excellent presentations. I think both of our speakers this afternoon, this midday, have set a very important tone for the discussion going forward, have not only enlightened us on the international agreements and the history of the development of the issue of climate change and how it had become mainstream into international agreements, but also the respective experiences of Germany in particular in providing assistance to these small climate-prone countries who don't have a lot of resources to deal with these issues. And also Dr. Mamudan has very interestingly shared with us that at the national level, at least Indonesia's commitment to climate policy seems quite real, but going forward, the more important issue is how do you integrate it to a more larger issue of the climate change as a security issue and a human development issue. Okay, so with that in mind, I believe we have another 35 minutes based on the agenda for question and answers. I'd like to invite the audience for their participation. Maybe we'll take a couple at a time. Please first you, and then sir, and then the gentleman on the right, and the madam on the front. And please go ahead, sir, the second row, gentleman on the second row, please. And I see a lot of hands already, so if everybody could keep their remarks short and please also introduce themselves, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rio. I'm a student from Universitas Diponegoro, Semarang. I've listened about the environment and security has a linkage to another types of security issues, that is energy security. And we have seen a discourse about how we should change from fossil fuel to non-fossil fuels that produce lower carbon for the planet. But from what I read, from my perspective, that there is hesitant in international society to develop non-fossil fuel plants. I would like to say a specific nuclear plant, nuclear energy, but there are also alternatives that other countries still hesitant to build it. But rather, even developed countries that already have nuclear energy, like Japan and United States, did counterintuitive actions like subsidizing coal-based energy plants. I want to hear a comment about this country. I want to hear some comments from the panelists about this counterintuitive acts from countries or even developed countries that actually they can do better, but they didn't. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question to Sonny. From your slides, I would conclude that LCDI Plus, which is the most ambitious plan, is a no-brainer, because overall the economic growth is highest, and the benefits are clearly there. So, I mean, how is this even controversial? So it's related to what you said about the things that are not discussed in Indonesia. If you could say a little bit more about the coal issue, because this is a big problem in Germany too. There is lots of employment involved, etc., etc. So if you could delve into a little more detail on that. And final question is on deforestation. Is there any progress, or do we see a further deterioration of the situation?
So first, many thanks for the presentations. My question is on the nexus with security, or even security and defense. And I would really ask you to shed a bit more light on that. I understand perfectly that there are a lot of indirect consequences and implications for many areas of policies, that it increases poverty, that there is more stress on economy, on fishery, that there will be refugees, climate refugees and all that, which puts additional stress on migration, and that has an indirect security dimension, of course. And of course, it detracts resources from, let's say, deterrence and defense, where they are urgently needed, also to this topic. And we have populist movements like Fridays for Future, which change governments, and also then their priorities in new governments, left party, green party, everything else. So indirect consequences a lot, but what is the direct nexus, the direct impact in terms of security and defense?
Thank you. I'll go ahead and
a lot of interesting questions, and certainly not that easy to answer. Let me just start with Rio. I think you were talking about the link between environmental security, environmental problems, and the energy security. And I think your question was, why didn't they do better if they could have, if I understood you right. Well, we just have to look at countries like Germany, Japan, India, who have that energy mix, not of course all the same, but energy mix with nuclear energy, with coal energy, and to some extent also non-fossil fuel energy. And so why do they still support fossil fuel energy plants, that is a matter of, well, pressure, political pressure, and as was just mentioned also, of course, the question of job places. So I think elected governments have to be rather careful in getting that right energy mix together. And if I can take the example of Germany, and it has been mentioned, it is not so easy to reduce the reliance on coal energy. But I think Germany is on a very good way there. It was one of 3 countries that has last week at the EU summit proclaimed that by 2050 it wants to be one of the countries that is carbon neutral. Unfortunately, that was not something that could be agreed upon by all the members of the European Union. So it shows you, I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, it's a story of pushes and pulls, of compromises, and it might take a while.
I think I'll response to the second question. Thank you. So I'll respond to the second question. The first one is the so-called LCDI, Low Carbon Development Initiative Plus. Yes, it's a no-brainer. It's intuitive. But again, this is a modeling exercise as part of the planning process in Indonesia. When it comes to realizing it, and that's the most difficult part, because it implies, for instance, a more, substantial handling of our coal, for instance, coal-based plant. Let me illustrate how entrenched and difficult the issue is. A couple of months ago, a minister was put in jail by KPK, so the Indonesian Corruption Commission Agency, or Corruption Eradication Commission. It involves a ministry, a minister, member of parliament, and so on and so forth. And they relate to, the case was related, or is related to coal-based plant using the so-called mine mouth, low calorific coal, a plant built nearby the mining areas, but then it is proposed so that it can also supply and become an important policy in Indonesia. So policy is there because of, to some degree, vested interest and other kind of interest. The point of saying this is not easy. It is an entrenched, politically involved, and so on and so forth. So the exercise, to some degree, sort of, putting aside some of the political dimension. It's difficult when it comes to coal or, to some degree, plantation-based issue like palm oil and so on and so forth. The LCDI Plus, so-called LCDI Plus, also involves, for instance, policy like putting pricing on carbon, which are now, like gaining ground, momentum. Economies of all theoretical persuasion are supporting this. But putting this in Indonesia is another, issue. It's not easy, those kind of things. So these are policies that are implied or suggested by having the so-called LCDI Plus. I hope I answered the first question. The second one is related to deforestation. There has been progress on reducing these deforestation, not so much to the extent that we wanted it to be, but at least progress are being made. The president will extend also the moratorium on concession and so on and so forth. So there are progress. Of course, we can discuss whether it's because of policy or perhaps some, like El Nino kind of effects. But if you ask me, I will be generous to say there's some elements of policy intervention that plays a role in these. And I hope it doesn't hurt to be a bit more generous. On coal, on the first question, if I may add, the discussion is somewhat shifted now when it comes to nuclear power kind of generation. We have the IPCC report for 1.5 climate stabilization target, which implies that we need to cut down like half of emission in a given time frame. The bad news is we do not have luxury like within decades, 1 or 2 decades, to really cut emissions. So if it is nuclear, it should be, you know, not only effective, but can we put it in place given time constraints? I think the latest discussion says this is not so much of an option. So I'm a bit cold. I'm not against or taking position pro or contra nuclear, but whether it can be applicable given time constraint and how it affects the development renewable developments. If we wanted to have nuclear base, how do we deal with, for instance, renewable energies, which is plunging in terms of price and keep plunging, so it becomes an option. So this is something we can discuss, but I personally see that nuclear hasn't been so much of an option in Indonesia. I think in Germany, you know, it's also shifting and moving into more renewable.
There was still the question of Brigadier General Meyer regarding the direct nexus between climate change and security. The line is not so straight. It is an indirect line still, but it will be probably an even more direct line in a few years. I mean, we've pointed out the various results of climate change which are already happening. Deforestation, pollution of oceans, and many other of the issues. I mean, that leads to direct questions as to, well, insurance policies. Reinsurance, Munich reinsurance, Swiss reinsurance have to raise massively their rates for insuring anything from properties to the various ventures. It is a matter of investments. Where do I invest? Can I put that power plant near the coastline or not? And I would say better not. It is a matter of, we have already at the moment more than 40 million refugees, and some of them are, if you take it in a true sense of the word, climate refugees already. Anote Tong, I showed you that photo. He mentioned it 7 years for the first time. But if you look at the refugee streams from Africa, a lot of it has to do with desertification, which is really increasing due to climate change and the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, the farmers not being able to farm their lands and not enough livelihoods. So there is an indirect link between that and security. And I think you mentioned also that there's a stress on resources. That exactly might have also implications on what can be invested by countries into the actual defense area. So if you have to pay more, if you have to, your outlays are higher on remedies, on trying to contribute, for example, to UN institutions and support the UNHCR program, because there is an increase, then of course you have to cut it down at another end. So in that way we have an indirect link at the moment, but certainly also an increasing one.
Thank you. I believe we have a little, still more time, a little over 15 minutes to ask for a second round of questions. I saw, there's quite a lot of questions. Let's see if we can have one from the back, the gentleman, and then the lady in the middle here, and over here, perhaps the gentleman in the back. Please. Can someone give him a mic, please? Please keep it brief. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunities. My name is Willie Wiryadi Sutrisno. I am a lecturer from Unindra University. And there is a simple question for me. All of us already knew that talking about climate change, we realize that it's a very serious issue in the world, especially Indonesia. Well, based on the slide that showing the monitor that climate change could be able to lose the habitat and biodiversity. But I think it's more than that. Basically that we lost also open green space, and we lost also open green blue space. In Indonesia we call ruang terbuka hijau and ruang terbuka biru. So it's very simple question, Your Honor, that do you have a role model, international or specifically Indonesia, Pak, how to anticipate these cases? Because according to my opinion or my research, between the scale 1 to 10, the critical already come to the 8 to 9. It's very serious critics. In other words, we have also got more import from the garbage, illegal export come to our country. That's already made to be strong issues in our country right now. So those are my questions, and thanks a lot for the opportunities.
Thank you. And then there's the lady in the middle over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Bella, and I'm from University of Indonesia, Faculty of Law. I'm currently researching about the climate change issue, particularly speaking about the commitments of NDCs of Indonesia, and also particularly on the issue of peatland restoration. So in this time, I want to ask strictly to Mr. Sony Mumbunan, because the first one, I think about the policy that we all know that the climate change, nowadays the policy, depending on the Paris Agreement, and you mentioned before that NDC is one of the national commitments, national, kind of policy, I think. And then as the NDC as the national communication and the and we can call it the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and you said that earlier it's a non-binding commitments. It is just a commitments. It's not legally binding. So my question is, do you think that this non-bindingness will affect to Indonesia's behavior in tackling the climate change issue? Yeah, it's about the behavior of Indonesia. So to achieve the Paris Agreement and also the goal of NDC, which is 29% of reduction emission and 41% of international, with international, kind of like that. And then the second one, my question is, what do you think of Indonesia's challenges on regulating the peatland policy? Because we know that peatland nowadays is really crucial and a crucial issue, and also Indonesia, we all knew that have resources in the peatland, because most of Indonesia's land covered by the peatland, and it also peatland restoration is one of the Jokowi's initiative to establish the peatland restoration agency, like that. And then so I think that is my question. What is the challenges of Indonesia in making the policy of peatland? I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have, I think, two more that I earlier you, and then after that you, sir. And please limit it to one question, if you could. Thank you.
Well, I'm just a citizen of Jakarta. It's like traffic engineer is there very, very important, because if you look at the number of medias they are reporting for about traffic engineers, you see like all 2016. How does, because, and also there are a lot of signs has been broken, and this is the Department Transportation and the Polantas. And is there any civil, society, like, professional also helping this, because when you see like this hub, they just use walkie-talkie, and the place also using the hands, so they don't have these data that are reporting what are the section local. Is there any that, because that also contributing, because in Singapore they have traffic engineer, in Malaysia, but in Indonesia, how's that?
Thank you for both presentations. I mean, at the moment we are all looking for avoiding or limiting climate change. And we put a lot of effort in there and we try to be successful. Is it realistic, or should we not at the same time have a view of what we do if climate change happens more than we would like to? So the euro or the currency in Indonesia can only be put once. And so should we have more attention also to what do we do if it happens against all our efforts? So how do we kind of divide the resources into one or the other? One country I know is doing very well on this is the Netherlands. The Netherlands are already prepared of whatever the level of the sea is going to be to have the country, the terrain safe.
Thank you. And since it is, I believe, after I give the mic back to our two speakers, we'll close the session. I want to perhaps invite Ambassador Schleifers to take the first question and any other question that she would like. And perhaps Pak Soni can answer the question specifically on peatland and traffic. And then if both could say something about the last question about, so how do we allocate given the trade-offs? Excellent questions, everyone.
Thank you.
Ambassador.
Thank you so much. I'd like to just turn to the question of the first question, loss of blue space, loss of green spaces. One of the mitigation factors, and I'll come back to the last question, to mitigate the effects of climate change is really to increase the green spaces. I mean, that is really something that you can do at the local level, and that is terribly important to kind of get the civic society involved and saying, all right, let's plant trees. Let's have a space that is up to the planning authorities of cities, of villages, not so much on the country level, to kind of say, well, we have to have a policy where we increase the green space. I do happen to live in Singapore, and there already 45 years ago, the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew introduced the Green City idea. So at every National Day, there is a tree planting of at least 10,000 trees. And I think Indonesia would be a good idea to do that also at the local level. What if it happens? Yes. That's a really terribly important question, and I think some countries are already in that process today to say, well, we have to do both. We have to kind of try to get our determination factors right, at the same time and reduce our energy footprint, but at the same time we have to prepare, as you kind of asked in your question, for the worst. So Netherlands is a really good model, but also what the European Union and other countries do in the South Pacific Island countries in terms of development assistance is mainly mitigating the effects of climate change that are already felt there, i.e. growing more mangroves in order to arrest the loss of coastline, building higher harbor walls. Again, the example of Singapore. Singapore at the moment is preparing exactly for the rise of sea levels, because as a small island country, it has to do that. So I think the answer to your question is, well, we have to do both, reduce our carbon footprint massively, and at the same time, and of course going to more sustainable energy, and at the same time preparing for what might be happening, unfortunately, a little bit sooner than later, and that what designed, if we say that the scientists are right, I think we have to really start as quickly as possible with those mitigation measures.
Thank you. So thank you for the question. I'll address, I think, the second questions on peatland. Again, there are different ways of responding to peatland issues, rewetting, revegetation. There are a list of them. I'm personally working also on the economics of peatland. I can also share, but I would like to use this opportunity to see the complexity of the issues. So when I mention response measures, with the case in point of peatland, I bring a very concrete, specific economic case, very important. In Indonesia, there is palm oil, to some degree, timber production on peat. Okay, this is a very serious issue. This contributes a lot to Indonesian economy. Now, this is impacted, these very specific sectors are impacted by climate regulation that the ambassador has mentioned, different kind of conferences and agreements that we operationalize in Indonesia and impacted these sectors. But peatland, palm oil, timber are part of a larger market. And if you see one of the very interesting slides, that thank you for pinpointing and showing us, the Friday for Futures, the Extinction Rebellion, changes of political votes in the Green Party in Germany is becoming for the European Parliament. And even the European Parliament across political spectrum oppose palm oil from Indonesia. It's beyond trade policy. It is, I mentioned in one of the discussion Pak Pilif and Ibu Puspa organized, maybe politically, or in terms of political science, maybe there is a changes between consumer preference into political preferences that is reflected in the way European Parliament responds to issues like this. So it's a complex, very complex issue. Now, I'm not taking a position on this. I'm a researcher. I'm trying to figure out sort of the optimal, if there is such thing. I'm thinking of fellow Indonesians that will be losing, they have to put food on the plate because of the regulations. Jobs, poverty. These are real people. I'm doing research on these. Okay? And at the same time, we know that we need to reduce emissions because of the life-supporting kind of arguments and so on and so forth. So first things first, we need to understand how the whole system creates synergies and trade-offs. And I deliberately show the Bappenas exercise, system dynamics or system thinking, to see possibilities of trade-offs or synergies. When we tackle fire, peat fire, forest fire up front, we may not need to spend our money, which is already lacking, for BPJS because of ISPA, respiratory kind of issues, right? These are examples of synergies. But this cannot be reflected in our budget system because our budget is so siloed. Our planning are so siloed. I'd like to invite you to come to the very interesting research by CSIS, Ibu Puspa, on the awareness of climate change. This is important but not urgent. Greta Thunberg is very influential because bringing it, the climate urgency into the table because it's urgent. Some are speaking of existential threat. We may debate about that, but at least if, our life supporting system are no longer there, we have a problem. But this is urgent and it hasn't arrived in Indonesia. We have luxuries here We can pick options. We can ignore options at the moment here in Indonesia. I mean, we are a small fraction of population in Indonesia, spending our morning thinking about climate change. The parliament, most of our fellow citizens do not care. So that's the status at the moment. I'm telling the planning at Bappenas doesn't mean the whole Bappenas is thinking that way. It's a section, a directorate within Bappenas, let alone among ministries, let alone ministries and local government. Sorry for being so honest. I can pinpoint these to the German situation. I mean, I spent years doing my master and PhDs in Germany. I can also show some of these silo things. So this is an issue of humanity. I was joking, humanity not always successful in dealing their own threat. But anyway, going to be, again, to be more positive. So we need to understand the connection. Science contribute and help a lot on that. We need to talk about policy based on this, you know, understanding trade-offs, how do you call it, synergies, turning into planning, into the way our budget, our resources, and then come to your question. Hopefully, by understanding this, we can have, you know, oh, okay, this policy is nice, but not effective, you know, given time frame, we will not pick this. There are maybe other policies that more superior or more optimal in that very sense. I hope I can address differently.
Can I just add,
please
in terms of peat fire, I think one aspect you did not mention was actually cooperation in between the ASEAN countries, or to put it more direct, the pressure of ASEAN countries to Indonesia to do something against it. And I think all these aspects help to kind of get the Indonesian government to take some action.
Thank you, that's fully agree. So there are pressures everywhere. Some are taken into serious consideration, and some, because of legitimate reasons, still need or remain to be considered into account. And as I mentioned earlier, when we put, just like the VAT jacket in the street of Paris, we introduce carbon tax, they fight back. That's exactly, or more or less, happening on the ground in Indonesia. We impose regulations, labor unions, you know, the palm oil, they strike back. I'm telling this is a reality when it comes to climate policies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I think perhaps I may just close by saying that for climate change, we all need champions, and we should start with ourselves. So I would like to close the session by thanking Dr. Mumunat, Ambassador Schley, all the participants who actively asked questions. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists, and I'll give the mic back to the Master of Ceremony.
Thank you for the fruitful discussions from our panelists. Now we will have a break until 1:45. Lunch will be provided at CSIS pre-function room right across the auditorium. Please enjoy your meal.